So you guys will have to bear with me. But if you have questions tonight, because we do have a special guest, you can put in the comments in the chat, put a big capital Q, and what'll happen is Erica will text them over to me. I'll check them periodically, moreover towards the end, because I want to give our guests plenty of time. I'm just checking Erica's my Google Voice, if that works for you. I don't know. Sorry, I'm just responding to Erica real quick, guys. So anyway, so this is real awesome because if I know y'all already know who we're having on as a guest tonight, and that's Eric Hernandez. Eric is a friend of mine. I wish I could say we go way back, but we've been communicating for a while now, and I'm just blown away by this gentleman, both at his apologetic method, but also as a theologian and philosopher. I think it's fair to call him both of those. So I'm going to introduce him in just a minute here, or let him go in just a minute. We'll get right into the interview and discussion. But I did want to mention that you guys can check out his website. I have put a link down below, and I believe I'll have to ask him and verify this, but I believe that he can accept donations from there. If not, I'll let him speak for himself here in a minute. You guys won't be able to hear him because I have him muted. And then do check out his website. And if you haven't seen some of his debates, like with Matt Dillahunty, check them out. Okay, they are awesome. He's done some others, which we'll be talking about in a little bit. So I just wanted to let you guys in on that right now. I am sorry about, for those that have tuned in yesterday, we had a power outage here. It's Florida. I know Eric's over in Texas. I'm sure he can confirm this, that they get them all the time too, from the thunderstorms. Normally they come and go pretty quick, but last night, I can usually tell if it lasts more than a few seconds. It may be a while, and it was several hours. We did get power back about 8 p.m. I think. But anyway, so thank you for the prayers and comments. We really appreciate that, all of you. So again, we will be taking some questions towards the end. I'll try to get to them, but I really wanted Eric to talk about a couple of things in particular, because he is on the ball with some topics in particular, and I don't want to give it away. We'll get to that in just a minute in the interview. So do check his website out. I know that I believe it's just erichernandez.com, but like I said, I'll let him mention that in a minute. And then I know he's on Facebook and Twitter, and I know you can find him on both of those that way. Real great guy, real sharp. Let me just make sure that you guys can in fact see and hear. Erica, if you're watching, let me know through text that the audio and video is working. Let me see if I pull it up. I'm afraid I'll mess something up. So Erica will respond to that in just a second. And in the meantime, Eric, are you back already, brother?
Yeah.
All right, let me bring you up here. Bring up your video. All right, so in theory, brother, they should be able to see you. All good, Erica says. Great. Okay, that is awesome. Thank you, Erica. I appreciate it. And for those of you that are wondering where Erica is, because we've been taxing the older children with watching the younger ones so much, she's helping out. Now I would just as much let her do the interview. I don't want y'all to think I'm being unfair, but I'm not kidding when I say I'm fond of what Eric's doing, and I couldn't wait to have this interview. So she knows how excited I was. So she said, you can do it. I was like, yes. So anyway, hey, it's good to have you on here, brother. Did I get the website right?
EricHernandezMinistries.com.
There we go. Okay. And do you have a Patreon account as well, or a way they can donate to your ministry?
No, but I believe on the website there should be like a donate button if anybody wants to.
Okay, great. I always like to mention that just in case, because you never know. And then anything you want to introduce about yourself before I get into some of the questions? I know some of them will be sort of basic like that anyway, but
not necessarily.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll follow your lead.
All right, brother. Thanks. And so yeah, we'll jump right into it here. So, and I know some of these for y'all that are going, oh, Sean, really? Some of these are real basic, but I came up with them just so that if anyone's not familiar with Eric, it might help a little bit. So bear with the first couple. They're just sort of softballs and warm-ups anyway for me. So what exactly is your channel, or rather it's really for you, it's ministry, all about, and who is it for?
So I probably started the channel because One, I just had some material or stuff recorded that I thought other people could benefit from, and just kind of put the stuff out there. I mean, especially if something like a debate where you're preparing, for a few months, and then it lasts a couple hours, and then it's like, wow, that was pretty quick. So, and also I found that, for example, I did a debate on abortion with the feminist lawyer, and it was a very great debate in my opinion. I thought it went really well. Uh, um, so well that I'll just say she's no longer employed with the pro-choice organization that she was with. I don't know why, but a few months after the debate, she was no longer employed there. But at the same time, later on that night, I had a handful of young ladies come up to me and tell me that they either came to the debate pro-choice or on the fence, and as a result of the debate, they were leaving pro-life. And that was just some of the young ladies that came up to me personally and told me. I'm sure there were more. And then thinking, long after I die, this video is still going to be up, for the people to watch and to kind of see, the arguments and the stuff that's going on there. So it was also a way to reach other people that I maybe don't know personally or couldn't reach myself. So its purpose is, especially now, is to be informative, to instruct, to teach. Some of the stuff I do, there's times where I'm thinking like, oh, I wish I could have recorded that, or oh, that would have been good, for other people to hear, maybe would have benefited from that. So it's a desire. I feel I have the gift of teaching, and I love teaching and instructing and showing. And I think this kind of information, I mean, people need to know about this. One, because the Bible tells us to love God with our minds, part of the greatest commandment, and also because we live in a society where these kind of things come up. And I can't tell you, I've lost count now of, and we can, talk more about this later, but of parents, friends, or coworkers, or people that email me, text me, message me, call me at least once or twice a month saying, will you please talk to my brother, cousin, father, whatever the case is, because they're having these questions, or they're atheists, or they don't believe in God. I was speaking somewhere one time to a group of church leaders, and this one lady, when I opened it up for questions, she raised her hand and said, I don't have a question. And then she just starts kind of bawling and basically saying that her son lately has been reading, books by like Hitchens and Dawkins and Harris, and how he's been not wanting to go to church, and he's had all these questions. And then it's as the more she talks, the more she starts crying and just saying, and I don't know how to respond to him because I was never taught to. And he has these questions because he was never trained how to answer these questions himself. And she says, please keep doing what you're doing, because I don't want more parents to deal with what I'm dealing with now. And it just broke my heart. I mean, it really did. And I can go on hours about that, but yeah, it's something that's needed. It's not something I do because it's fun. It is fun. I do enjoy it. I don't mean just debates. I just mean learning. I'm kind of a nerd that way, but also because it's what the Bible commands us to do, whether I like it or not. I don't always feel like talking with people. I don't always feel like preaching. I don't always feel like doing these things, but yeah, like I tell my daughter, sometimes I'll say, hey, you're gonna have to clean your room or do this. She says, well, I don't feel like it. And I say, well, that's perfectly fine. You don't have to feel like it. You just have to do it. I'm not asking you to feel like it. I'm just asking you to do it. And that's kind of the approach I take when it comes to, what the Bible instructs us to do, whether I feel like it or not. Life and the purpose and meaning, all the everything that's going on is much bigger than I am. And I always keep that perspective in mind. And so why not share what God has called me to do and what I do with other people, when they can just, within a few clicks, learn, disagree, or, things of that nature. Everything being at your fingertips, why not throw more stuff out there like that?
Yeah, amen, brother. Yeah, that's awesome. I know. Give you a break. Take a sip of water here. As a pastor, when I was a young guy, and even just in Bible college over 20 years ago, apologetics was different than what it is now. I mean, granted, yeah, the material was there, but we didn't have the vibrantness that we've got, and of course, internet was very new still by the standards that we have today. And I just love the time period we're in. But I know what you mean. Sometimes it's like, I don't know if I really want to do this, but I'm called to do it, and so I'm happy to do it. But yeah, it can be difficult. But that's awesome, brother. That is awesome. So I did have another question, sort of in the same vein, which is, if any, and this could vary. It doesn't have to be, your answer doesn't have to be specific to this question. You can vary it if you'd like. What do you have any favorite ministry or or apologetic experiences? Could be a debate or something like that.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of stories I've often shared. It just depending on the situation or kind of the mood I'm in, or how the audience is responding to some of the stuff I've saying. But some of the most memorable were two specific instances, and I usually share this whenever I tell people about how apologetics is needed. One instance was I was invited to speak at this Christian school, and it was going to be on apologetics. And when I get there, one of the teachers pulls me to the side and says, "Hey, just heads up, one of my students today told me that there's an atheist in the school, and he's going to be here, but they wouldn't tell me which one." And I said, "That's fine. I don't have a problem with that." And then before I was going to speak, another teacher pulled me aside and said the same thing. So anyway, so I talked for about an hour or so. I take questions for about another 30 minutes or so. As I'm taking questions, there's a young man in the front with his arms crossed, looking kind of upset, and he just kind of yeah like that. And as he just kind of looks uncomfortable, and then just like looks around and kind of shrugged his shoulders like, "I've had enough." And he raises his hand, and I said, "Yes." He goes, I don't believe in anything you just said. I'm an atheist." And everybody in that room just went completely quiet. And I said, "Okay." I said, "Well, why not?" He said, "Because there's no evidence." And I couldn't help but laugh, not in a mean way, but I just said, "So what about the hour-long talk I just gave? What do you think of that?" And he said, "Well, I don't believe in that either. I don't believe in this and that." I said, "Okay, well, why not?" He said, "I just don't." Um, After a few more questions, I begin to kind of feel the spirit nudge me. And what's important about apologetics is, and one thing I try to emphasize when I teach is it's not all just this relationship evangelism God thing isn't just about being intellectual. It's also being sensitive to the spirit. And so there's times where I'll feel the Holy Spirit say, "Hey, this person at this point doesn't need an intellectual argument." I'll give those if that's needed, but sometimes, you know, for lack of a better way to put it, you put on your pastoral hat, if you will. And I said, "So tell me about what happened or how you became an atheist." Long story short, he was talking about how he was praying. His parents wouldn't get divorced and whatnot. They ended up getting divorced. God had answered my prayer, yada yada. And that's when we kind of just started talking and being open with each other. And I said, "Well, I have a grandparent at the time who had cancer. My grandfather was 91, and he had cancer. And they said, do you want to just kind of let it play its role? Or do you want to take treatment?" And they said, "There's only been one other person that at this age who had cancer and took treatment and beat it. So, you don't, we can't promise anything." Long story, well, at the time, we didn't think, we weren't sure he was going to make it. Thank God he's alive today. I think he's like 96 or 97. But what I was telling him was, whether or not my grandpa lives, I'm praying that he does, but whether or not he lives or not is in no way does that change the truth of whether or not God exists. And we're not in that. And then I added some intellectual stuff. We're not God's pets. It's not his job to keep us happy, and et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, so for those few moments when we're talking, I literally felt like no one else was in the room but me and him, and it was just like a one-on-one personal conversation. And after after I kind of like snapped back into it, I noticed other people had their hand raised. So after I go to that at the end, as I usually do, I kind of give like an altar call and say, if there's anyone here who, and as I'm saying this, I'm kind of just looking at the floor, and then I just happen to peek my head up to pan the room, asking, if you want to give your life to God or give God another chance. I had forgotten about that conversation. I look and I see him in the front row. He has his hands in his pocket. He kind of shrugs his shoulders. He shakes his head and he picks his hand up. And he rededicated his life to Christ that day. About a month or two later, when I went back to the church for this event they were having, I saw the youth pastor. I said, "Hey, by the way, how is so-and-so doing? Is he still coming to church?" He said, "Oh, you didn't hear? He's not only coming to church, he's now part of the praise band. He now plays guitar in the worship band."
Hey, man, that's
And
awesome.
I mean, I still tear up. I'm surprised I didn't tear up telling the story now, every time I think of that. But there's another moment where, won't mention the name of the church, but I went to go speak somewhere, and there's a story to that. But I was recommended by someone else to speak there, and they were looking for a youth pastor and whatnot. Anyways, I had lunch with the pastor before the service, and again, to try to keep it brief, I remember he was pretty much asking me some questions, and it kind of felt like at some point he kind of was over. In other words, he's like, "Yeah, I probably shouldn't have invited this guy," because it's as if everything I was saying. So first, it was asking about the youth pastor position, and I was being honest with them. I said, well, I don't necessarily feel called to be a youth pastor, but I'm called to serve, and whoever and however that could be, I'm willing to do that. And he didn't really like that. Um, in fact, kind of said something like, well, why are you wasting your time and my time? Why'd you come? And I was like, well, we know someone that we both respect highly who recommended me to come here. And, anyway, so we're at lunch and he's like, so at the time he was asking, do you use slides for your verses? And I was like, no, I don't use slides for my verses. He's like, oh, well, I do. I'm like, okay, all right, preference, I guess. And then he's like, so I hear you do apologetics. I said, yeah. He goes, yeah, I don't think there's a need for that behind the pulpit. Maybe a Bible study, but not the pulpit. And so I'm just thinking, like, what am I doing here? Like, why are we having lunch if all he's going to do is contradict everything I say? So fast forward later that night in the service, which he didn't even go to, the youth service I was speaking at. In the beginning of the service, or right there, before I started actually preaching the topic I was going to touch on, I did talk about what I do in apologetics. And then I said, I'm not here to talk about that tonight, but if you have any questions on that, see me at the service. You can ask me whatever you want, Okay, so again, fast forward. There's a young man who comes up to me with his mom right next to him. Mom looks kind of worried. He comes right up to me with his mom and says, you said we could ask you questions, right? And I was like, yeah. And I'm thinking, gosh, did I say something wrong in the sermon? Did I offend him? And he says, see, Mom, I told you. And I'm thinking, oh, is everything okay? She says, yes, I just wanted to be sure that, he was telling the truth, that you did say anyone could ask you questions. I said, why is that? Well, the kid was an atheist. He was a junior in high school, very smart. The questions he was asking later, I even said, what books have you read? Because the average person doesn't ask these questions unless they have some background knowledge of the stuff. And he's an atheist who is very influential. It was a very, very small town. So everybody knows each other. And basically, it got to the point to where the youth pastor and the pastor told him, you can no longer ask questions here. Don't ask the students questions. Don't ask the ministers questions. If you're going to come, you can't be stirring up trouble like that. And here I am going to try to hold back tears because hearing that first really, really broke my heart, because the kid had some serious questions that he was honestly seemed to be struggling with. And we talked for a good hour or so, to the point to where the person locking up the church is like, hey, you guys have to leave. I have to go home. So, we just have, and on my way, literally as I was on my way walking to my car, he's just right behind me, just still talking. And I said some things he had never thought of before. Now I'd have to look into that. I recommended a few books and gave him my card, whatever. But we got to talk, and he told me, I've never met someone like you. And I hear that a lot, and I'm not tooting my own horn here, but every time I hear that, one, I'm glad, because now I can be a point of contact for that person. But at the same time, I'm thinking, you've been in church for how long? And I'm the first person that you've met like this.
Right. You got to ask yourself why. Yeah.
Exactly. So the pastor, before we left, the pastor's like, hey, let's do breakfast in the morning. And in my mind, I roll my eyes like, for what? But okay. So we're having breakfast, and then I say, hey, pastor, and I'm thinking, this guy's not going to invite me back. So, what's the point of, not that I wanted to be rude, but there's no point in, any kind of courtesy of saying what's on my mind. I said, you mentioned yesterday about apologetics not being needed behind the pulpit. I said, you have an atheist in your youth group, right? And he kind of looked at his plate and fiddled with his napkin, and he kind of giggled and said, yeah, that's so and so. We're praying for him. I said, it's going to take more than that. I said, and that this kid is incredibly smart and influential for his age. And if you lose him, you're not just going to lose him. I guarantee you're going to lose him, and he's going to take half the youth group with him, because that's how influential he is. And even if it's just for one kid, he has the potential to make such an impact that it can either be for the kingdom or for the enemy. And I've seen that happen. It still saddens me to this day to say I don't know what happened. I gave the pastor my card because I didn't want to give it to the kid. I didn't want to be disrespectful. So I gave the pastor my card and said, would you give this to him? He said he would. Never heard from the kid. Those two situations really stand out in my mind, and just kind of reminds me of just what we're dealing with. The Bible says that, Christ was willing to leave the 99 for that one sheep. That can play out in a number of ways, including apologetics. Surprisingly, atheists, the population of atheists, it isn't even that big, but they're very loud and very influential.
That's right.
And apologetics isn't just for non-believers, it's for believers. I got into apologetics as a believer because I had questions. In fact, two of my youth pastors I got in trouble with because of the questions I asked. They even told me, hey, stop, you're just trying to be a contrarian. I was told this as a Christian. I can just imagine what a non-believer would feel like. And one time when I was talking about, one of the areas I like to focus on is the existence of the soul. And when I was talking to somebody about this, they said something like, yeah, well, you know what, our kids don't really ask those kind of questions. And my first thought and reaction was, I said, with all due respect, it's that kind of attitude that could have led me to losing my faith if it hadn't been for my atheist professors encouraging me to look into this stuff. And then I said, also, I guarantee you, it's not that your youth group doesn't have these questions.
Yeah.
They're going to have these questions, but if they're not asking these questions, which is a different story, then that's not a good thing. That's a bad thing and a reflection on whether or not they trust you guys at the church to be confident and confidential in the doubts they have. In other words, it's not a matter of whether or not these kids have those questions. It's whether or not they're bold enough to ask them. And if they're not, something's going on. So yeah, it's just I always keep those two stories parallel in my head, and it's just a constant reminder of we're not here to just feed ourselves. We're not here we're called to serve. That's what ministry, that's what the term minister literally means. It's servant, that's what we're called to do. And that can play out in a number of ways, whether it's, being behind the pulpit or, I have a few guys that would travel with me. One of them recently passed away, and all he would do is help me with my CDs and help me when I travel. And in his mind, I remember him telling me, I feel like I'm not really that important to this group. And I said, are you kidding me? And his name was Danny. I said, dude, if it weren't for you, I couldn't do the things I do after the service, because by the time I get from the pulpit and try to get back, people stop me, people want to talk to me. I said, you are incredibly valuable, to this ministry. So whether you're behind the pulpit or behind the scenes or behind the soundboard, whatever the case is, your wife, in the other room, keeping an eye on moderating, whatever the case is, you're called to something, but you're called to serve. And gosh, Hosea 4:6 says, my people perish for lack of knowledge. I think there can't be enough apologists out there. And I'm just preaching here, so you have to forgive me.
Oh no, brother. I know you're ordained as well, so I don't mind at all. I mean, even if you weren't, it wouldn't matter. But yeah, no, I've done many jobs as a pastor, associate or otherwise, mainly mowing lawns and other stuff like that.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, I know how it. Yeah, we're all called to serve and do so. And same thing. We had a guy at our church, Charlie Brown. No
Really?
kidding. And he was a World War II veteran. When I knew him, when I met him, I think he was 96 or 97, and he was a ranger and stormed the I forget which battalion it was that hit Normandy. I think it was Utah Beach, the guys that scaled the cliff straight up. Might have been Omaha, I don't remember. Awesome guy, just incredible, servant's heart. Same thing, just awesome. So, right on.
Yeah.
So these next two are easy, and I know they're going to be short answer, but I got to ask them anyway because I ask everyone these two. Favorite philosopher and or theologian?
J.P. Moreland, hands down. He both as a philosopher and a theologian. Even though his profession is philosophy, he touches a lot of theology. I mean, of course, I would argue you can't do theology without philosophy, because anything that's gonna deal with theology is gonna deal with metaphysics, and anything dealing with metaphysics is a branch of philosophy. In fact, philosophy is inevitable, of course. But Moreland, because for those who may not be too familiar with my background, to condense it, and I say it all the time, and it's never too condensed, but basically my freshman year of college, both my philosophy professors were atheists, and one in particular, comes in and he says something like, religion wants us to believe in the soul, and because of the soul, we can have hope in an afterlife, and we can have hope in seeing our relatives that passed away and whatnot. He said, but according to religion, the soul is not physical. And then he pulls out this antidepressant pill and says, and this pill right here, if I take it, it can affect and change my moods, which are allegedly in my soul. But if my soul is non-physical, then how is it that this tiny antidepressant pill, which is physical, how can that physical thing affect the non-physical? Because every time we look at the brain, all we see are neurons firing. Every time we look at the body, all we see are the base elements and carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, but you don't find a soul. He says, so what do we do with that? how do we explain that? He says, I'll tell you how we explain it. There is no soul. There is no God. There is no heaven. There's no hell. There's no afterlife. We're just physics and chemistry all the way down, and we need to learn to live with that. See you next week. And as a freshman in college, not only had I never heard of anyone disbelieving in the existence of the soul, I never heard an argument against it. So I was floored. I was shocked. I didn't know what to do with that. I didn't even know where to start with that. So just to fast forward there, when I heard of Moreland and, heard the stuff he was talking about and stuff about the soul, and I ate it up. I mean, so quickly, so much to the point that the car I relatively recently bought about 5 or 6 months ago is the Kia Soul, just because it says the word soul, and it makes for a good punchline when I teach on the soul. But yeah, I mean, his work has been very influential. And then just the more I hear him and how transparent and honest he is, how blunt he is, sometimes even without a filter, which I love because I'm kind of the same way. How honest he is, how funny he is, and just the heart that he has. He's, I don't know if I want to say one of the few, but one of the few I know of that are not only intellectual, but also don't neglect the gifts of the Spirit, the work of the Spirit in the body of Christ. And I mean, he can hang with the best of them on both sides. And a lot of his stuff and the way he teaches spiritual formation, the way he shares, it's really, really beneficial. And it really has helped in so many areas of my life, anything from marriage to ministry to personal prayer. I mean, he makes a case for something. Him and Craig, I appreciate the way they articulate what they're trying to convey. Growing up, and stop me when you need to. Growing up, I just remember, again, I was always one to think and ask questions. And to me, it felt like every youth camp and youth service was the same message. Don't do drugs, don't have sex before marriage, don't smoke, don't drink, and follow Christ. And it's like, you tell me one thing to do and 10 things not to do, I still don't know what to do. I relate it to the analogy of say you come to I invite you to, let's say, a class on how to bake a cake, and I stand up behind this pulpit, and y'all are there to learn how to bake a cake, and I start yelling and screaming and shouting and telling you, what ingredients you should not use, what not to do, how that if you do this, you're going to burn the cake. And I get you excited. I get you emotional. We sing songs about cake. You cry. I pray for you at the altar. You fall down. And at the end of the service, you may be emotional. You may be inspired to bake a cake, but you still don't know how to bake one. You're just really excited about the fact that you want to bake a cake, but you still don't know the ingredients or the process. To me, that's what every service felt like, just about. And I couldn't stand it. So to hear someone not just make a point, because sometimes I don't know what some of the points were when I hear some preachers talk, but to walk you through how they came to that deductive conclusion of that point, which happened to be a theological point that was powerful to the fact that it changes and amplifies your perspective of God. And that, I mean, I fell in love with philosophy and apologetics and theology, not because it taught me how to respond to atheists, but because it taught me how to love God deeper. It taught me how to understand God in a totally new light, to where, it makes sense when you read scripture and, the rich young ruler says, good teacher. And Jesus says, why do you call me good? You don't know me. Why would you call me that? I know why my disciples call me that, but why do you call me that? You don't know me like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome, brother. And yeah, it's funny because I was having this conversation with Erica. And now anyone that enjoys negative theology, let me not offend you. When I say I dislike negative theology, I don't mean that there's anything wrong with it. I'm just merely saying, it's not my cup of tea because of the same thing. Now, for those of you that don't know, that is whereby we would describe God by what he is not. Well, that's great, but we should be able to describe him by what he is. Therefore, if there's 10 things and we say, no, he's not 6 of these, well, then he's 4 of them. It's just, sort of obvious. And sometimes people use that as a disguise so that they can not, they want to tread carefully and not offend people. And I understand that. I really do. But in the same way, it goes back to Eric's point about the sermons and these services. And what does Paul say? He says, think on these things, whatever is lovely and just and perfect and all these good things. He doesn't say think on the things that are negative so you don't do them. He's talking about all the glorious things. So, amen, brother. That's awesome. So I'm going to jump into the question I got. So just for those of you, I'm being selfish here. Eric, it's been a while now, maybe, I don't know, 4 or 5 months ago at least, I think, was kind enough to take me through his argument for the soul, or maybe all, I don't remember. It's been a while. But in particular, and you can do this in any order you want, brother. And anything you want to cover, you have free reign on this. But for us, we've been covering a lot of philosophy on here, and we're going to be getting into metaphysics in the future. But you know how this stuff is when you have to boil it down. And the way you explain it and some of the categories, and it's just brilliant. I love it. And so I was wondering if you wouldn't mind talking about either or both, anything you want, really, brother. But this is the treat for those of you guys that are Patreon supporters. And I said, we got something special for you. Eric agreed to do this, and I appreciate it because I don't have you done this before on YouTube for anyone else?
Done what?
Broken this stuff down, yeah.
Not extensively. I mean, just here and there. But I mean, yeah. But no, I'd love to get into it. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh man, have at it, because I'm telling you, all of our subscribers, I mean, at least the ones that I've talked to, love this kind of stuff. I mean, otherwise they wouldn't be on here doing it. So have at it, brother. Any order, any way you want to cover it, whatever you'd like. But I'll just be here hanging out. When I mute my microphone, can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
I'm not sure.
Okay. I'll mute it and I'll test it real quick, just in case. If I know they won't be able to, but that way, it's because I don't want to mess with the screen when I talk or move my chair. I don't want the screen to go to me and I'm over here picking my nose or something. So anyway, I'll mute it. No problem. But anyway, yeah, any way you want to do it, brother, any order, anything you want to cover, really. But I'm excited, and yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'll just, so whenever I talk about the existence of the soul, or when I argue for it, and when I teach on this, there's basically, I approach it by demonstrating two basic points. The first point being, and I kind of feel like I should get a whiteboard here. The first point being that consciousness is not physical, is my first point. My second point is that I am not my brain and body, or identical to my brain and body. I am a soul. So first point, consciousness is not physical. Second point, I am more than my brain and body. I am a soul. Or I am not my brain and body. I'm a soul. Now, if you demonstrate these two, I would say that the conclusion would be that the soul exists. Now, first, really quick, why is this important? Well, Paul said, if there is no resurrection of the dead, then our faith is in vain. When I debated Matt Dillahunty on the existence of the soul, about a week prior to the debate, out of curiosity, I turned on he has a show in Austin called The Atheist Experience to see if he'd mentioned the debate, and he did. And he said this was probably going to be one of his favorite, if not favorite, debate to do, because it was different than the God question. He said also, and then he said this, he said, the Bible, or Paul said, that if the resurrection didn't happen, then Christianity is false. So if you want to disprove Christianity, all you have to do is show the resurrection didn't happen. He said, but there's another way to do it. If you disprove the soul, then there can be no resurrection. And again, if there's no resurrection, Christianity is false. I thought, this guy gets it. This atheist gets it. When I have trouble getting, people to like my, Facebook page or subscribe to my YouTube channel, and this guy gets it, this atheist gets it. So it's really important. And of course, there's so many other things we can get into just even later, whether or not we're purely physical and material. Do animals have souls? Things like that. A lot of implications basically to this. Free will. I mean, a number of things. So it's important, one, because I would argue, and I know there's some Christians who would disagree with me, and, we can go there if anybody wants to ask about that. But if there's no soul, there's no resurrection. And there's even problems with how the resurrection would happen, even if someone would argue that there is a resurrection without a soul, something immaterial. Okay, but that being said, first, consciousness is not physical, and then I am not identical to my brain and body. Now, how do we know that consciousness is not physical? Because, see, first, it's important to understand that, and this is all metaphysics, philosophy of mind. So there are things, think of water. Water can come in three different states. So there's states and properties. It's important to understand what states are and properties. So things like water can come in various states. Water is a substance. So you have water as a substance, and then the states would be solid, liquid, or gas. And the properties are going to identify and tell you what state it's in, and it's going to give you an idea of what kind of substance you're talking about. So if I said that water I'm looking at has a property of being wet, then you know it's in a liquidity state. If I say water right now is it has a property of being hard, it's in the solid state. So when you understand the property of a certain state, it gives you an idea of what the substance is, and properties help you identify states. Okay, that being said, consciousness, what is it? For whatever reason, in some recent discussions I've had, like in the discussion I had with atheist Tom Jump, which you can find on my channel, and I even did some highlight videos on that, a couple of them. Him and a few of the atheists I've talked to would say things like, "We don't know what consciousness is," which is bizarre to me. I don't consciousness. I would say consciousness is the one thing that you can be absolutely certain about, and I would even dare say you can be more certain about your conscious mental state and your soul than you can be certain about your own body. You can be more certain about that than anything physical.
Yeah, can I jump in for a second?
Yes, please.
It's funny because I've heard Tom Jump say that before with you, and then with somebody else in a debate, and I went, yet he uses not Hume, not Kant. He uses cogito ergo sum
Descartes.
all the time, and I'm like, how can you tell me that you can't be positive of anything? Now he's gone on since to say, well, I know that I exist because of that. I'm like, well, you'd have to have consciousness for that. It's just inconsistent. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, and I have, and yeah, and I've had some Christians, and I think they mean well, who say, well, I think you misunderstood him, Eric, or this is what he was trying to say. And don't get me wrong, while I can appreciate someone trying to be charitable, and I think I am charitable, the questions I asked and the responses he gave, he made it pretty clear. Now, I can understand if someone says we don't exhaustively understand what consciousness is. Even then, I could maybe see that, disagree, but that's neither here nor there. But basically, his assumption is that consciousness is physical, and what he was really saying is we don't know how consciousness works or where it comes to be. That's a separate question than what it is. Okay, but even then, and we can get into the weeds of that later. Nevertheless, consciousness is what your mental states and experiences. If right now you can just introspect, right now, if I took a minute, I can introspect and think, yeah, my back's kind of hot. Maybe there's a little bit of sweat going on. Yeah, my left foot, feels there's a little bit aching there because I was standing up earlier. I got an itch in my right arm, and if I start concentrating, I can kind of introspect and see what I'm experiencing. That's consciousness. Now, consciousness is one of those things that you have to define ostensibly. Now, what that means is things that are defined ostensibly are things that you have to point to or give examples of in order to define. For example, how do you define the color purple? How could I define the color purple to someone born blind? I could not. Now, a physicalist might argue you can describe their wavelength. Yeah, telling me the wavelength of a color doesn't tell me what color it is, because I don't know wavelengths. I know colors. Now, wavelengths may be associated with colors, and I'm jumping ahead of myself here when it comes to consciousness in the brain, but they're not the same thing as colors. So, before I go any deeper there, there are 5 states of consciousness, just like there are 3 states of water. It is you have thoughts, desires, sensations, acts of will or volition, and thoughts, sensations, desires, acts of will, and gosh, what's the other one? 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, I just had a blank. Long day. Thoughts, sensations, thoughts, beliefs. Right, beliefs. So, beliefs, thoughts, desires, sensations, and acts of will. Now, why just 5, or how do we know there's 5? Because any mental state you can point to is going to fall under one of these states. Any of these properties you can point to going to fall under one of these states. And how do we know they're different? Now, this is going to get into what's also going to be important to understand when we get into the arguments is Leibniz's law of identity. When there's a longer word for it, but we can just call it Leibniz's law of identity for short. And it's basically the idea. It's like a rule of thumb or like a measuring stick. If you want to know whether or not 2 things in question are identical, you would have to ask if whether or not they share the same properties, because at minimum, if something is identical to something else, if X is the same thing as Y, then at minimum, they're going to have to share the same properties. And if there's at least one property that's shared that one possesses that the other one doesn't, they're not the same thing. So in other words, if Eric Hernandez is the same person, literally the same person as Kendall Hernandez, my wife, if he's the same person as Kendall Hernandez's husband, then we're not talking about two people. We're talking about one person using two different titles. And in philosophy, that would mean that's a relationship of identity. Eric Hernandez is identical to Kendall Hernandez's husband. And again, by identical in philosophy, that literally means the same thing as. Now we use it in a casual, loose sense to mean similar. It doesn't mean similar. It means literally the same thing as. Okay. So if Eric Hernandez is the same person as Kendall Hernandez's husband, then whatever properties he has, Kendall's husband's going to have those properties. So if I'm, 5 something, then, Kendall Hernandez is the same thing. If I have, black hair, Kendall Hernandez's husband's going to have black hair because, again, we're talking about the same person. We're just using two different names. Now, if in principle I could find a property shared by one that's not shared with the other, then automatically they can't be the same thing. The example I usually use, suppose you walk into a laboratory and you see 2 bottles of clear substances, and you want to know whether or not these substances are the same. Are they the same substance? Are they the same thing? So you let's say you pull out a notepad and you say, well, they're both clear fluids. And they both have properties of being a clear fluid. So far, I think they're identical. They're the same substance. One, you notice one bottle has labeled water. The other label says chemical X. You turn the bottles over and you see that on the back of chemical X, it says caution flammable. And you think, okay, well, I know that water's not flammable. Therefore, even if I don't know what chemical X is, at the very least, I now know that they're not the same substance because one of them has a property that the other one does not have. So even if they might share some properties, the fact that there's at least one property that's different automatically entails they're not the same substance. Because if they were, they would share the same properties. Okay. That being said, we can even do this with the 5 states. Like, for example, beliefs and thoughts. Someone might think, why are those different states? Well, are there things true of one and not the other? Sure. I can have thoughts that I don't believe. I can entertain a false belief. And it's a thought, but I don't believe it. And I can also have thoughts. I can also have beliefs that I'm not currently thinking about. In order to have a thought, it has to be in that moment, it has to be occurring. In order to have a belief, I don't have to reflect on it. So I can have thoughts I don't believe, and I can believe things that I'm not currently thinking. Therefore, they're not the same state. And we can go through each one of those, but there's 5 states of consciousness: thoughts, beliefs, desires, sensations, and acts of will. Okay. now that, and we're still not getting to the arguments yet, still a little bit more unpacking. Now, is conscious physical? Because remember, my first point is that consciousness is not physical. And if there are any questions coming up, you can let me know if they're relevant. If there might be some that come up that might be relevant later on. Okay. Is consciousness physical? I would argue first that consciousness is not physical. Okay. Why not? Now, remember the example I used earlier about my professor saying that we're just physics and chemistry. In fact, Tom Jump said that consciousness is physical. And I asked him why. He said, because if you affect the brain, we know that it can affect your memory. Okay. Now, the reason that doesn't work is for the following. Remember, we talked about Leibniz's law of identity. When X is the same thing as Y, if Eric Hernandez is the same thing as Kendall Hernandez's husband, that's a relationship of identity. So in order to show that the mind is the same thing as a brain, in order to establish that relationship of identity, that they're the same thing, you have to show they share the same properties. Now, if I rub 2 sticks together really fast, I can cause a fire. But does it follow from that therefore 2 sticks rubbing together and fire are the same thing? No, of course not. No, wood, sticks have a certain color. Fire has a certain color. They don't share that property. So in other words, so then what is that? Well, that's a cause and effect relationship. But a cause and effect relation is not the same thing, nor does it establish identity. If I play guitar and let's say I'm the greatest guitar player in the world, if you untune my guitar, it's going to affect my music. So my ability to play is dependent on the guitar. But does that dependent relationship prove that therefore I am a guitar? No, of course not. It's just the instrument I use to convey the talent I have. Let's say I'm the worst guitar player and I have the world's greatest and most expensive guitar. Well, it would help me play good music if I knew how to play. But again, just because I'm dependent on it doesn't mean I'm the same thing. Well, what about the fact that if I pop a certain amount of strings, I would no longer be able to play the note C? Does it follow that therefore the note C is the guitar, or that the note C is in the guitar? Much like people say my thoughts are in my brain. No, I can't. If I were to crack open a guitar and shake it a little bit, the note C is not going to fall out. It's not as if, if I go play a concert and I get on stage and think, oh my gosh, the note C, it must have, guys, give me a minute. I need to go look in my trunk. I think it fell out. No, they're not in there. Now, the note C is dependent on and caused by a certain number of strings being pressed and strung, but just because it is caused by that, it does not follow that the same thing. Now, back to the excuse me. Back to the thing about what Tom Jump had said, and other people, what people usually say is, well, you have Alzheimer's, you have these mental disorders or these brain disorders, it affects your mind. Sure. What does that show us? That there's a causal dependent relationship between the mind and brain.
Right.
That's fine. Does that show that they're not that therefore the mind is physical? Of course not. Well, why not? Because in order to do that, you have to establish identity. Now, we still haven't given the argument yet, but let's get into a little bit about how we would argue for that. Now, consciousness is not physical. How do I know that? Because they don't share the same properties, simply put. Just like the fact that if chemical X has just one property that's not shared by water, they're not the same thing. Okay, if consciousness were physical, we would have to reduce it to something like the brain. I mean, really, that's all you got. So if consciousness, if the mind is the same thing as a brain, then all the states of the brain should be shared by the states of the mind. Now, we know that when I think of puppies, I will have brain state X, meaning when I have a certain thought, my neurons will fire in a certain way. A neuroscientist can take a picture of what my brain looks like when I think of puppies. Does it follow that therefore thinking of puppies and those brain firings are the same thing? No. Mm-hmm. Why? Because they don't share the same properties. So, for example, my thoughts can be true or false, but no state of my brain is true or false. I can't say, well, this part of my brain's true, but this one up here is false. That doesn't even make sense. My brain can weigh 3 pounds, but the thought that I'm talking to Sean does not weigh 3 pounds. Moreland says a joke, philosophers may have heavy thoughts, but we don't have to wear neck braces. My brain can be 7 inches long, but the taste of banana, which is a sensation in my mind, a mental state, is not 7 inches long. So while we can go through a dozen more things, the simple fact is that if all the properties and states of the brain are physical, and all the states and properties of the mind are not physical and not shared by the brain, then it follows that if consciousness exists, it can't be something physical, because every property of the mind, the states of the mind are going to be non-physical, and every property and state of the brain is going to be physical. So all it would take is one example. We can go through dozens, but that alone there would show that consciousness is not physical. I'll go ahead and take a pause right there.
Okay. That is awesome. We had one question, but I know from what I'm going to be asking you, we will get to, I don't think it's related to the soul. Let me just double check it. And so that I don't want you to lose your train of thought. We'll get to it though. Air Church, we will get to that question. Erica sent it to me. I goofed. Sorry, I didn't address that sooner. I had the wrong app open, or I actually don't have the correct app on this phone. So I'm sorry about that, Air Church. But are there any questions on what Eric has covered in regards to these categories and whatnot so far, these ideas of metaphysics? And let me say this while you guys are responding, if anyone has a question about what he's covered. Guys, I think it was William Lane Craig, and Eric can correct me, that has said that this argument is when folks have said what is going to be things that are going to need to be addressed in the future, this is one of the things, that this argument for the soul. And I wholeheartedly agree with Eric that this is critical in that it relates directly to the resurrection, which if there's no soul, I mean, I know there are some Christians that want to hold to a purely physicalist view that there's no intermittent state. maybe that's the case, but I don't think so. And I think Eric's right on this. And so I think that this argument is paramount for us as Christians to learn this and understand it. And particularly, not just the argument, but notice what Eric's giving us is the material that we need to understand all of these underlying questions. So let me see, were there any other, Erica, were there any other questions related to this? I see Eric Churches go, oh. Yep, no, I don't see anything yet. But we'll keep that in mind. Let me see, I think I had a question. Wasn't that? So, Eric, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I just making sure I didn't make that long diatribe and my microphone was muted. That would be bad. With states and properties, so I'm tracking on, states for like water would be solid, liquid, gas. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then the properties would just be the form that of the state. That's where I was trying to take notes quickly and I missed something there.
So the properties will identify what state a thing is in, and that could be and that's where it gets a little bit more complicated of what a state is, but it'd be like an event or mode of existing. So when things are in a certain way, or things are happening and changing in a certain way, then those bring about states. So when water freezes, then it changes states because something occurred. There's events happening, and a group of those things, or when things happen, they represent states of a thing, states of a substance.
And there's okay, yeah. I just wanted to make sure I had that right, and then I guess I could just rewind the video later on. Like I said, for those of y'all that aren't asking questions right now, man, you have no idea how much this means to me, because I'm telling you right now, this is. I know this will sound tacky, the argument of the future. All right.
Yeah. And even just a few other, so we can even get into the relevance of it more, and just getting started here too, because when it comes to, again, consciousness, its relevance plays a big role here, because if consciousness is simply something physical, then there would be no free will, because all your thoughts would be something physical, and something physical would necessarily be caused by something else that's physical. And that we get into that later on, because that's an argument I use for the soul. But going back to the consciousness thing, now, just to throw a few more of these out there.
Can I interrupt you real quick?
Yes, please.
We had a couple questions come in now, and I just want to make sure, because there's a delay, I forget that. So one, and I'm sorry to interrupt you on that. Okay, so Corinth is asking, and I'll let you answer this. What are some resources for those that want to investigate this further? And there's another question, but I'll let you answer that first.
Sorry, I happened to yawn right when I muted.
Oh, I'm sorry. I can answer it.
No. One of my absolute favorite is J.P. Moreland's book, Body and Soul, Human Nature and the Crisis in Ethics. And that not only is really good when it goes into a lot of what I said and more, it also goes into ethical issues that would, at its root, deal with the existence of the soul and personhood. So, for example, well, I may want to save this for when we get into the soul specifically, which would show that I'm not my brain and body. But, like, for example, when it comes to the abortion issue, well, the question, when is it a person? And I'm using air quotes here. What makes someone what is a person? And whatever a person is, what is it grounded in? Because one thing I was going to say relevant to consciousness was properties, talking metaphysics, properties themselves are necessarily possessed or owned by something else. In other words, properties don't show up in the world all by themselves. When I get on the freeway, I'm not afraid that I'm going to hit the property of redness with my car, but I would maybe be cautious of hitting an object that possesses a property of being red. So redness does not exist and pop into the world by it. We don't see redness floating around in the room saying, "Oh, well, watch your head." It's always possessed by something else. So if properties are necessarily possessed by something, then you have to ask the question, what are the states and properties of the mind possessed by? Is it possessed by something physical or not physical? And that's where you transition to the arguments for the soul. In other words, I love how Moreland put it. Thoughts have thinkers. And when he said that, it just kind of blew my mind. Like, what? Thoughts don't float around by themselves. Every thought is necessarily owned by a thinker. So, and we can go into this, and I wanted to mention a few more things about consciousness. But in other words, so when we transition to that, though, it's like, okay, well, we know that consciousness exists, and the properties of the mind must be owned by something. Well, what possesses consciousness? There's one thing I am absolutely certain that possesses consciousness, and that's me. I possess consciousness. Now, the word I is an indexical word that is used to refer to something. When I say the word I, what is that referring to? It's referring to me. Well, what am I? Because whatever I am is going to be what possesses the properties of the mind. And again, properties give you an idea of that state that the thing's in, and that gives you a good idea of the kind of thing and nature that possesses those properties. So if I know that I'm conscious and conscious is not physical, what kind of thing am I? That's where we get into the arguments for the soul. To just take a few steps back really quick, there's a lot of other ways we know that consciousness is not physical. There's something called the argument from first person introspective or private access, what it's called. And it's basically the idea that if consciousness were physical, then you should be able to know everything about my conscious life by just looking at me physically. So you, as a third party observer, you should be able to know what I'm thinking if consciousness were physical. But you can't. Now, I brought this up with Tom Jump, and he said, well, no, because I can't see every cell and atom, whatever. I said, well, let's just grant, hypothetically, you could. How would that change? Again, the way Moreland puts it, and I'll sing Moreland's praises all day, which he's actually going to be speaking for one of our conferences in November, which I'm nervous and excited about because Leighton wants me to speak at that one. I'm like, everything I say is going to be from him, so he's going to probably sue me for just copying what he says. But okay, so a neuroscientist can know more about my brain than I do, but he could never know more about my mind and mental life than I do. When you look at my brain, you're not going to see my thoughts. You'll see neurons firing, but neurons firing are not the same thing as my thoughts. So if it were physical, though, you should be able to look at my brain, know what I'm thinking. Now, before we get into some objections that usually come up, the point here is that anytime when you look at me, let's say you look at me and you see something fall on my toe and I say, ow, you assume I'm in pain. Well, what's pain? Mm-hmm. How do you describe pain? It hurts. Well, right. That's kind of a synonym. Well, you're describing mental state. You're describing sensations. How do you know what a sensation is? Well, you experience it. Okay, well, how do I know what you're experiencing? I don't. Why? Because consciousness is first person. It's private access. Only you know what experience you're experiencing. That's called qualia or quell. Every mental state is going to have a specific mental texture to it. In other words, here's a thought experiment for the listeners. How do you know the difference between pain and pleasure? Think about that for a second. How do you know the difference between pain and pleasure? Well, because of what they feel like. Right. Well, in other words, if consciousness were physical, I was talking to David Smalley once, an atheist who also debated, also one of my favorite debates. It's on my channel. We're talking one time, and he was saying, and I said, well, pain's not physical; it's in the mind, not the soul. It can be caused by things in the body, but again, that's just a cause-effect relationship. It's not identity. And I said, well, do you think consciousness is physical? He said, of course. That pain is physical. He said, of course it is. I said, well, how do you know you're in pain? He says, I just feel it. I said, oh, so you don't walk around with the brain scanner all day, and you don't like something, you don't have a weight fall on your toe, and you say time out, and you open up your computer and say, oh, look, oh, I'm in brain state X. That means I'm in pain. Okay, oh, ow. No, you're in pain because of the mental experience, the qualia that you have. Now, that's another thing is your qualia. First of all, it's first person introspective. You don't know what I'm feeling. You assume what I'm feeling. But here's another thought experiment. For all you know, when a weight falls on my toe and I say, ow, I could be experiencing the mental state of the taste of strawberry. And when I experience the taste of strawberry, I say, ow. But you could never know that. Why? Because consciousness is not physical. And that gets into what's called the problem of their minds. But the point here is simple. The point is not, okay, is everybody else conscious or not? The point is, if consciousness were physical, we should be able to know these things. Now, a common objection I get to this is people saying, okay, wait, but there is technology now that you can look at a brain and tell what a person's thinking, or you can do a brain scan and you can get you can from that derive some kind of an image of what they may be thinking. And I say yes and amen. Yeah, but how did we get that information? Well, here's the complicated experiment that they did. Let's say we now know that when someone is asleep and there's rapid eye movement, that means they're in a deep, like REM sleep, and it means that they're dreaming. How do we know that rapid eye movement equates to or equals the correlation of dreaming? Well, because the complicated experiments that scientists did was they put these brain things on a patient, they told him to take a nap, and they stood there with a clipboard. It must have been really awkward. And when the person finally went to sleep and he said, you know, what's going on? His eyes are moving. What's going on in his brain? This is going on. Okay, take a picture of that and let's call that brain state X. Okay. Excuse me, sir. Hey, what are you doing? Oh, I was dreaming. Oh, about what? About puppies. Okay. Let's try that again. Go back to sleep. You know, do that a number of times with a few hundred people. And after a while, you're going to find the correlation of what brain states happen with certain thoughts and mental experiences. But here's the point. If consciousness were physical, you wouldn't have to ask the person what mental state they're in or what they're thinking. You would just be able to see it. But given that it's not physical, you have to ask the person. So how is it that in some cases we can look at a person's brain and know what they're thinking? Because we had to ask them in the first place, and we assume everybody else is thinking the same thing. But once again, here's another thing to think about. I had a friend who I worked with. He could not see the colors green or red. It's a certain type of color blindness, and there's a variation of color blindness where there's some colors you can't see. And it's crazy because the way I found out, there was this I worked at a school, and there was this poster of like Skittles, and they had like all the yellow Skittles said a certain word, and all the blue Skittles said a certain word. And when I looked at it, I'm like, oh, I never noticed that this poster had words on it. He said, what do you mean? He goes, let me see. And he looked at it, he goes, I don't see any words. I go, you don't see that there, and this color and this color? He goes, what colors? He said, you mean the yellow ones? I said, no, there's no yellow. Like, what are you talking about? And then he says, oh, he goes, well, I'm colorblind with the, and it blew my mind. And then from that day on, every day I'd see him, I said, hey, so what does blood look like to you? Hey, what do trees look like? Hey, how do you know what stop, when the stoplight is green or, I said, I had all these questions, but the point was, he and I can both look at the exact same object, but have different mental experiences. I could not have looked at his brain and knew that. He had to tell me. Now, someone could argue, well, we know that if you're missing certain parts of the eye, we know that you'll be colorblind. But again, how did we know that? We had to ask the person.
Right.
We had to ask them. If I go to the eye doctor and he says, hey, read this letter for me, I say, oh, that's the letter B. And he says, no, what an idiot. That's the letter 8, actually. No, he doesn't say that. He believes me because although he can look at my eyes, and even if he needed to look at my brain, he doesn't know what I'm mentally experiencing, because again, consciousness is not physical.
Awesome. Thank you. There's a couple more questions I wanted to squeeze in. I'm going to prioritize these guys for those of you asking the question. So I might, because I sort of have an idea of where Eric's going, I may push them back towards the end, some of them. But Andrew asked one that I was wondering about, because I think I got 6. And I think he was just asking, Eric, the 5 things of states of what? States of beliefs?
I'm sorry?
States of consciousness?
Yes.
Okay. And what were those again? Sorry.
Sure. Thoughts, beliefs, desires, sensations, and acts of will, or you can call it volition.
That's why I had 6. I put volition as a 6th one. Okay. So those are states of consciousness, guys. Could you maybe maybe the question might be for a little bit of expounding on the states of consciousness, perhaps? I'm not sure how much that needs.
Say that again?
He may be asking, Andrew might be asking for a further explanation to the states of consciousness, or did you already forgive me here? I mean, I guess that's pretty straightforward, yes?
Well, again, to define consciousness, you define it ostensibly.
Right.
Sorry.
Things you point at then.
You point out or you give an example of. So, say you met a person who's never tasted chocolate before. I once met a person who never tasted Nutella. He never had it, I'm like, dude, you never had Nutella? Okay, so now let's say he not only never had Nutella, let's say he's never had chocolate. How do I describe that to him? It's sweet, maybe. Okay,
Yeah.
well, that he would have to first know what something sweet tasted like. It's creamy. He would have, in other words, in order to describe a sensation he's never experienced, I have to point to sensations he has experienced. But
Right.
even then, he has maybe never experienced all these sensations together to know what I'm talking about. He would have to experience it. So, what's a thought? If you want to put it in a philosophical statement, it would be propositional content that you reflect on.
There you go.
But someone may not even know what I'm saying. But my 10-year-old, and even when she was 4, if I ask her what a thought is, she say, "Yeah, I know what a thought is." If I say, "Do you understand what a propositional content that you're reflecting on is?" No, I have no idea that is, but I know what a thought is, right? So
Right.
these are things that we all experience, and that's the thing about consciousness. Of course, we know what consciousness is because we experience it every single day. Now, you may not be able to articulate it, but again, I think that's because consciousness is not one of those kind of things that you necessarily articulate. It's one of those things you cite examples of. Again, I can't explain chocolate to someone who has never tasted chocolate before. I can't describe the color purple to someone who was born colorblind. I once heard, and just a side note, I once heard someone say, for us here on earth to try to grasp and understand heaven, if God were to try and explain heaven to us, it would be like trying to describe colors to someone who's blind. It's just that beyond what we can even think of it. I've heard great things about it. Can't wait to go. But yeah, so consciousness, it's a mental experience, which we would call qualia. There's a texture to these experiences, and we can categorize these states by their properties. Thoughts can be true or false. Desires are not necessarily true or false. For example, my desire for pizza is not true or false because it's the wrong category for that kind of question. Just like, what does the number 2 smell like? Well, that's an incoherent question because it's a category fallacy. It's not, you don't put smell to the category of numbers. Same thing with these different states of consciousness. Each have their own separate category because they each have their distinct properties that are not shared with the others. There's some may overlap, like thoughts and beliefs, but again, I can have beliefs I'm not currently thinking, and I can think about things I don't believe.
Awesome. Thank you. I think that will definitely help. It certainly reminds me. JMD Apologetics 101 has a question, and
Okay.
I think if it needs to be pushed back to later, just I'll ask again. But he's asking, what happens with the soul when people are asleep or unconscious? Just a curious question. Like I said, if that needs to be.
No, that's fine, and we can, and with that question we can even transition to the arguments for the soul. But what happens to it? And hey, by the way, JDM, I was on his channel once. Awesome guy. Met him, I think, a year or two ago. Maybe it was a couple years. So no, I mean, nothing happens to it. It's just inactive at that point. When you can be unconscious, your soul can be unconscious. It's still there. You still exist. You're just not using anything. Those so. And this we'll transition into, and I'll push it to later to go deeper. But basically, you as a person is grounded in something. Actually, yeah, well, I'll have to push it there, but I'll just say it's grounded in something, and it can't be grounded in anything physical. So who you are is grounded in your soul. You are your soul, and your nature would be to simplify it, a grocery list of ultimate capacities of dispositions, abilities. Even if those abilities aren't being actualized, they're still grounded within your nature. In other words, I can speak English. When I go to sleep at night, can I speak English? Well, sure, I still have the ability to. I'm just not utilizing or actualizing that ability. So everything's still there. You're just not using anything. So,
Perfect.
okay. Now let's go into arguments for the soul. I am not my brain and body. Again, really quick, just to summarize, properties are necessarily owned by something. We've already established and talked about how the properties of the mind are not physical, and they're not shared by any of the properties of the brain, so consciousness can't be physical. Properties of the mind are owned by something. They're owned by me, but what am I? Am I physical or non-physical? Okay. Now, to understand this, more terminology is coming. We'll have to understand the difference between a substance and an aggregate.
Yes. Yes.
So, let's start with an aggregate. 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 And this is concerning, if you want the bigger word than that, mereological aggregate. Mereological. And you can really impress your friends with that one. Basically, what that means is that so an aggregate is something that's an aggregate in our context here would be basically a collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. And again, for this context, we're talking about purely physical objects, because technically an aggregate is just a collection of parts that can be separated. So they're separable parts, and that's the important thing. So an aggregate would be a collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. I say it like that for a reason we can maybe get into later, because Thomism could come into play if anybody out there is a Thomist and whatnot. I had a discussion on Thomism also on my channel. You can check out there. But they're separable parts, not just parts, but separable parts. So things like watches, cars, and Legos would be aggregates. They are an existence of separable parts held together in a certain structure. Now, the thing about aggregates is that their existence is, and their identity, what they are, is necessarily dependent on the parts and the structure. For example, if I go to my garage and there's a pile of 10 wooden boards, well, I would call it a pile of 10 wooden boards. If I reconstruct those wooden boards into a square shape with a bottom, then I can now call it a raft. Same amount of boards, but now the structure is different. So now its identity has changed. If I get a tricycle is a tricycle in virtue of the fact that it has 3 wheels. The moment I remove one of the wheels, it is no longer a tricycle, but now a bicycle. Why? Because purely physical objects, aggregates, their existence and identity is necessarily dependent on the parts and structure they possess. Okay. Contrast that with substances, which traditionally speaking, substances, the prime example of a substance would be a kind of a living thing. Now, one of the my rule of thumbs for identifying the difference between a substance and an aggregate, we're already talking about part to whole relationships. So that's important. Part to whole relationships. Now, the relationships of part to wholes for aggregates and substances are both different. They're polar opposites. So here's an example. We'll start with the aggregate first. If I remove a tire from a car, it still is a tire and it still exists as a tire. What does that mean? Now, what that tells us is that the existence and identity of the tire was not necessarily dependent on its connection to the car as a whole. So for aggregates, the parts give existence and identity to the whole. For substances, it's the opposite. For a substance, the whole gives existence and identity to its parts. Let me explain that. When a puppy's born, it may not have the function of being able to see. It may not even have his eyes fully developed. But note that the dog as a whole exists prior to the functioning and development of its eyes, which means the dog as a whole came prior to its parts. For substances, it's the opposite. Tires exist prior to cars. In order to have a car, you need to first have the existence of a tire. If you don't have tires, you can argue there is no car. For substances, like a dog, you need to have a dog before you can have dog eyes. Dogs come before dog eyes. The substance comes before its parts. So, to summarize it, an aggregate, its parts exist prior to the whole. For substances, the whole exists prior to the parts. If you remove the parts of an aggregate, they maintain their identity and existence. If you remove the part of a substance, it loses its identity, and that's evidenced by the fact that it ceases to exist. If you cut my arm off, it loses its identity as my arm because in a few days it will decay and cease to exist. So for substances, the parts depend on the whole. For aggregates, the whole depends on the parts. I'll take a pause there because I know there was a lot to take in.
That was awesome, brother. Thank you for that. Yeah, I'm being selfish to y'all. No, because he explained this to me months ago, and I was like, oh, this is awesome stuff, and I wanted to hear it again because it helps. And again, I can't say this enough with understanding. If Eric just gives us the arguments and goes, boom, 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 here's the arguments, we don't have any of this background data, it's going to be rather difficult. Corinth had asked a couple of questions, and again, Eric, feel free to say I'll answer that in a bit because I have them written down here. So he had two questions, and they're sort of related, so that's why I've saved them. Out of body experiences, what degree of validity should we give these in general? And I think I can see where he's coming from in regards to the soul there. Does that question make sense?
Yeah. So the same validity you would give anything else. If by validity you mean the specific case by case that people give, sure, be skeptical until you have evidence, to know that what they're saying is true. But if by validity you mean are they possible, I would say absolutely. I would say they're not only possible, I think they've actually happened. I know Moreland and Gary Habermas wrote a book. I think it's called Near Death or something like that, or Beyond Death. I haven't read that one yet because I heard Moreland recommend a different book called Imagine Heaven, which I've read about halfway through, which is basically a collection of near-death experiences. Habermas talks a lot about these, so does Moreland. And I mean, the stories they tell are absolutely incredible to the point to where it's not just like, oh, my cousin's brother's uncle's neighbor's son
Right.
heard this story. It's they've interviewed these people themselves. There's, doctors have signed off on what was said. I mean, something as crazy as, and I may not get the story exactly right, and it could be looked up, but I've heard this from both Moreland and Habermas that there was a lady she would get these things in her brain, like these tumors in her brain. And then there was one that she got in a part of her brain that was so dangerous that in order to, that they could not just go in there and cut it out because it was in a part of the brain that if it was cut, she would literally bleed to death. So she found a specialist, and I think there's only like maybe 2 in the whole world that did a procedure that had only been done, I think, once successfully.
Wow.
And she went to this doctor and he agreed to do the procedure. For this kind of procedure, what they basically do is very complicated. They bring the person into this room. They lower the temperature. They put them to sleep. They lower the temperature to a certain temperature, a certain degree of being cold. They cut the person, I don't know where, and completely drain every drop of blood out of their body. So they freeze the body while the person's alive, drain all their blood out so there's not a drop of blood left in there. Then they're able to safely go in, remove the tumor, and then they only have a certain amount of time to where they have to put the blood back in, and at a certain degree, gradually, at a certain way, raise the body temperature back up and then resuscitate the person. And that's the procedure. It's a very complicated procedure. Again, only 2 people in the world are qualified to do it. Well, interestingly enough, this lady had a near-death experience. And after the procedure was done, she told the doctor, yeah, I saw what you did. And he's like, yeah, okay, whatever. And told the nurse. And so the doctor, again, I don't remember exactly the details of this part of the story, but the doctor's pretty much, okay, let's hear it. What'd you see? And he thought she was going to say something like, what she's seen on movies. She described everything so well that it was like I could teach a class using her testimony of how she described the procedure. She described things that you're not going to see in a movie. Because again, this is the procedure has only successfully been done once. The type of tools they used, the way they did it, what the doctor was doing, just details. You can't say, oh, because some atheists might say, oh, that's just oxygen deprivation in the brain. Sorry, when you don't have any blood in your body and you're under the knife and you're not only flatline, you're dead basically on ice. Yeah, that's not oxygen deprivation of the brain. And even if it were, how are you going to get those details right? There's so many. And I'll just share one more. One that gave me chills, because people might think, well, these are stories that give people hope or they're happy. Not all of these are happy endings. In fact, a good number of them are kind of depressing, or really like, gosh. Okay, so here's one. There was I don't know if it was a little girl or a little boy that basically had passed away, and I think for she drowned or something for 30 minutes, was gone. And then throughout the next few months, the kid would bring up, these stories about heaven, and, the parents didn't really know what to think of it. One day, I think it was like Christmas or Thanksgiving. And it was a young kid that, doesn't really, let's just say innocent and naive. The kid said, hey, I didn't know I had a sister. And the mom and dad were like, you don't know, you don't have a sister. Like, you're talking about your cousin Sophia? No, I'm talking about my sister. And the mom looks at the kid and says, what was her name? And she said, oh, she told me y'all never gave her a name. In fact, she said you sucked her out of her tummy. The father didn't know about that. And because of that, and because it was said in front of the family, they ended up getting a divorce a few months later. That's not a happy ending, but this is just a child reporting the facts of what they saw. The mother had never told anyone, much less the father. And there's no way this kid would have known that. The kid doesn't know what an abortion is.
Right.
But I mean, yeah, I saw my sister in heaven and she told me you sucked her out of her tummy. I mean, when I heard that, I both got chills and I teared up. I mean, so again, there are a lot of things like that. And there's Habermas, you can look up the lectures he gives on that. A lot of interesting stuff on how they determine when you have this level of, when the brain's been dead for this long, or there's this and this going on, we know for sure the person's not there, and all that other kind of stuff. But yeah, it's certainly possible. The fact that you're not your body, there's a correlation relationship, but they're not the same thing. I can go to more illustrations, but yeah, hopefully that answers. So sorry for being long-winded.
No, brother, that's this. We love this. Appreciate it. Going into detail like that. Yeah, Habermas has got some great lectures on that. I think we've all heard the one about the woman with the shoes up on the top that she saw when she's going up the top of the roof there, and all kinds of cool ones like this. And I think it's a half an hour on the timeline for the, I think it's brain activity and no heartbeat. I think. Now I could be, my medical training stopped when I got out of the Army. So it's been a long time. I did trauma. I had learned trauma and triage stuff, but it's been too long. And then some of these other ones, Corns had another one, but I'm going to wait because I'll let you present the argument. I think it'll be good at the end. And Erica had some, which I think all of us are going to want to hear the answer to that. So I'll save those two for the end. So carry on, brother.
Yeah. Okay. So let's get into, and usually we'll do about 3, maybe 4 arguments for the soul. Time flies when you're having fun with philosophy.
Oh, I know. I looked up, I was like, oh my goodness, are you kidding me? I mean, I don't know that anyone minds, but yeah, whatever time you have, we appreciate you being here and doing this.
Like I said, my wife and kids are out of town, so I'm in no rush. It distracts me from being lonely.
Man.
So am I the same thing as my body? Because if consciousness exists, and it's not physical, and I possess the properties of being conscious, then if I'm not my body, then I must also be something non-physical. So again, to refresh on Leibniz's law of identity, if 2 things are the same, X and Y, whatever's true of one is going to be true of the other. If in principle you can find something true of one that's not true of the other, they can't be the same thing. Okay, which one to start on? Well, actually, let me start with one that's not necessarily a law of identity thing. This was an argument that philosopher Eric Larock came up with. And I forget what the title of it is called, or what the thought of me is called. But basically, we know that there are certain regions of the brain that are correlated with certain mental states. Neuron C fibers firing is correlated with sensations of pain. But again, correlations are not. I think it was philosopher Kim Jaegwon Kim, who's not a believer, I don't think, and doesn't believe in the soul, but he says something, and I think Nagel said this too, where basically some atheists will say, oh, well, we know that it's a correlation, or we know that this, or there's an emergence going on. Correlations are not explanations, but are the very thing that need explaining. So just because you put a label on something doesn't mean you've solved the problem, you've just labeled it. So even though we know the correlation, that doesn't explain anything. That doesn't explain, it doesn't do us any good. So we now know that when you look at an object, like if I'm looking at this cup here in my hand, we know that different regions of the brain are correlated with recognizing different aspects of the object. One part of my brain is correlated with the processing of the color. One is correlated with the shape, the size, whether or not it's in motion, the distance. So different regions of my brain are correlated with different parts of the object. So what, quote, the brain does is when you look at an object, it breaks the object into individual properties. But there's no part of the brain that kind of puts these back together into an image. So to figuratively explain this. When I look at an object, it filters through my eyes and kind of breaks like a prism, if you will, into its separate properties in my brain. But there's nothing that puts it back together. Now, this is the argument from the unified visual field, and what's coming from the more popular unity of consciousness. So here's what Eric LaRocque argues. I paraphrase and modify his illustration. I like mine better. Don't tell him I said that. He talks about a chef. Suppose there's 5 chefs, and they each go into a kitchen with 5 different rooms. And here's where I modify it. Suppose I get a list on how to bake a cake. I mean, the ingredients for a cake. And I give each chef a certain part of the recipe of this cake. And I say, you guys work on this recipe. So they go into their separate room and they lock the doors. And if you were to zoom out of the whole building, you would see 5 chefs working on one cake. But even when they're done, all you have is 5 different pieces of the cake. You still need some master chef to put it back together to make one unified cake. When it comes to the way we see things in our mind, not our brains, the unified visual field, if the brain breaks up an object into individual properties, then you still won't have a unified visual field. All you would have is 5 different chefs in different parts of the room in one building, but it's not put together. What you need to have a unified visual field is a master chef, aka a soul, something non-physical that would transcend the body, act as a master chef, and bring all these things together to make one unified image. It's kind of like if you look at a picture, you see one unified image. You don't see a picture of a color, a picture of a shape, a picture of this, and then you know, okay, how do I got to put these together? You see just one image. In your mind, you see things as one image. You don't see individual aspects of things. You see the whole thing all together. Why is that? Because there is something that transcends the body, the physical, namely the soul, that gathers the information collected through the eyes that the soul uses and puts it into a unified visual field. Without the soul, there would be no unified visual field. There is a unified visual field, therefore the soul exists.
Nice. Any questions on that anyone would have? Eric, can you state those premises one more time? I realize, again, this is on video. I don't know why I'm asking, but you never know what might happen.
Yeah, no,
right?
That's fine. And I even kind of, the way, I don't know how he puts it in his, in the way I'm writing it, when I'm in the process of writing a book, I think I write it something like I'm either a purely physical object or a soul. If I'm a purely physical object, then I cannot have a unified visual field. I do have a unified visual field, therefore I'm not a purely physical object, therefore I'm a soul. And you can however you want to vary that. I think what I initially said there earlier, just for the sake of brevity, was something like, if I don't have a soul, then I cannot have a unified visual field. I do have a unified visual field, therefore I am a soul.
Just works either way. But yeah, I like them both. Thank you. Let me check I forget there's a delay. I always forget that. So I'll go, oh, there's no questions. All right, let's go on. Then I realize, and then like a minute later they pop up because there's latency on it. I do know I know there's going to be lots of questions on books. So while I'm waiting to see if any questions come through, so a quick tip, because we just did a library thing on our channel 3 nights ago, and we were showing all the books. Mentioned Moreland's book on science and scientism. That one actually has some of this information in there, sort of. Not Eric knows what I'm talking about. I'm guessing he probably has that too. Not in the way Eric's presenting it at all. And then I just ordered. It'll be here tomorrow. The Moreland's book that Dr. Moreland's book that Eric recommended. It's a big, thick one, I think, on the soul.
Body and soul.
And be careful, because if you're wanting the one he recommended, don't do what I did. I got the small little white one. It's like, I don't know what, 150 pages, which is good. It's just not going to be as thorough. Is that fair?
Yeah. I think that one says the soul, how it exists and why it matters, something like that. Yeah. I mean, I enjoyed it, but the thick one you're talking about really goes into a lot, really in depth and a lot more exhaustive. And even then, it's not completely exhaustive, because I mean, you get more questions. The more you know, the more you have questions about things. But I mean, it definitely will hit the spot, for lack of a better phrase, when it comes to these kind of questions. It'll explain a lot of what I'd explained, and maybe even go deeper and make it applicable to areas like cloning, euthanasia, when a baby's born. Sometimes there's twinning where they split, and then sometimes the twin can be reabsorbed back into the other twin. What happened, or is there a soul? Dillahunty asked me something like that, and then I don't even know if I want to open this can of worms this late, but then you get into the origin of the soul. How does a soul come to be? Is it a creation? There's a creationist view, and there's a what's called the Traducian view. Again, I won't get into it unless someone asks, but we can.
Okay. But yeah, I may ask you that sometime. That's awesome. But I did have a question come through, which is interesting too. I like this. It comes from Corinth Chandler. He's one of our regulars, a great guy, awesome guy, and he asks, then our concept of the soul in this case will be broad enough to encompass animals, yes?
Oh, absolutely. And this is my personal rule of thumb here. we can know something that has a soul if A, it's conscious, and B, the whole is prior to its parts. So we know it's a substance. And I would say if it's conscious, automatically you got a soul. And I would just either of those two. Well, definitely you need the conscious thing to establish a soul, but to know whether or not it's a substance is a whole prior to the parts. And if you check that, if it's conscious, then for sure it has a soul. So definitely the conscious thing would definitely go there. But then sometimes you might think, okay, let's look like at a jellyfish. Well, is a jellyfish conscious? But we do know that the whole comes prior to the parts. It's a living organism. So we would say that, I would say, it has a soul. It just has a different kind of soul. Now that gets into the nature of the soul and the variety of souls. Just like just like there are a variety of species, there are a variety of souls. In fact, I would say that the reason there are a variety of species is because there are a variety of souls. So Moreland puts it this way: the soul is an external realization of an internal structure. Now, and we're diving into metaphysics here even more. So your body is a reflection of your soul. The reason you have the body that you do is because you have the kind of soul that you do. An example illustration I came up with: if I were to put a blanket over an object, even though I can't see the object, I can see the form that the blanket takes. And the form that the blanket takes gives me an idea of what's underneath the blanket. Your body is like the blanket to the soul. The form and shapes and parts that it puts together gives you an idea of what kind of soul you have. So the reason I don't have, let's say, wings is because I don't have a soul that's capable of doing that kind of those kind of functions. Let's look at it. And so souls are different. Let's look at my soul and a dog soul. Now, I know a dog's conscious because, I can relate to the experiences he seems to have. Oh, when you make those kind of noises and I make those kind of noises, I'm feeling this. So I assume you're feeling that too. The other thing would be, now, both the dog and I are conscious, but we have different souls and different abilities and capacities of consciousness. For example, yes, a dog can think and I can think. However, I can think about my thinking, whereas a dog cannot think about its thinking. I can have thoughts about my thoughts, but a dog doesn't seem to have thoughts about his thoughts. Why? Well, because he doesn't have that kind of a soul. Now, you might argue, well, because his brain's different. Right. And on my view, you have the kind of brain that you have is a reflection of the kind of abilities and capacities that are within your soul. So your soul is what forms your body. And that's another big topic, but your soul is what unites and gathers the parts of the body. And Moreland goes into this somewhat, and there are other people who can go way deeper into this, that basically you look at DNA and it's pretty much all the same parts, just arranged differently. And your soul, and so something needs to guide that. And DNA is the information, but information by itself does nothing. A pile of alphabet, a box of alphabet cereal or soup doesn't spell anything. You still need that, again, master chef to put things together. So the soul is what drives the DNA. And if I have the capacity for sight, then my soul is going to develop a body with eyes. If I have the capacity for sight and smell, my soul is going to develop a body with those things to utilize its capacity. So the capacities and parts you have are a reflection of the capacities of your soul.
Awesome. That's awesome, brother. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. It's almost as if, well, maybe I should keep my mouth shut there on that.
No, it's good. It's almost as if, when I was studying this, I literally put my books down, sat on my couch, I looked up at the ceiling, I just thought, wow, like this Mind blowing, because it's almost as if what Scripture says, that everything that is seen was made from the things that aren't seen.
Yep.
And that's why the things that aren't seen are eternal. The things that are seen are temporary. So wait a minute. So you're telling me that everything physical here is like a blueprint of something? My body's a blueprint of what? My soul.
How
And truly, it's like so it's like the physical realm is like a shadowing of the what's. So people think, atheists tend to think that the realest you can get is physical matter, and I think, oh, absolutely, it's a complete opposite. Moreland pointed something else out once. I heard him talk about, you can't define or describe even matter, anything physical, without appealing to the mind. So if anything, the mind comes before matter. How do I know? How do you describe hardness? That's a physical property. How do I describe something hard? Well, dense or not dense, and this and that. Okay, but right. Okay, but what is dense? At some point, you're going to appeal to a mental state. But wait a minute. If you appeal to a mental state in order to even describe a physical state, then it means that in order for anything physical to exist and to have knowledge of that, you must first have a mind. And if mind is not physical, then it would show and demonstrate that the immaterial necessarily comes prior to the physical.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Any other arguments you want to mention?
Yeah. So a few more, and I'll just, we can go through them quickly, and then we can finish up with questions if you want. And I'm not rushing, by the way. Just
No, I understand.
So the other three I was going to use was an argument from the indivisibility of personhood, an argument from the indivisibility of personhood. What was the other one? Another one is free will. Oh, and identity through change. So identity through change, indivisibility of personhood, and free will. We'll start with the identity through change. Another difference between substances and aggregates is that a substance, or rather an aggregate, does not maintain its identity through change. And we kind of already touched on that. If you're the famous example that's often used in philosophy classes is called the ship of Theseus. I explained this a little bit in my latest video on my YouTube channel regarding my interchange with atheist Tom Jump. We got into this. And so I'll explain it there. It's explained there with some visuals. But the ship of Theseus was basically a question, an illustration used to ask the question, do physical objects maintain their identity throughout change and part replacement? So here's the experiment, the thought experiment. So this guy named Theseus, he's a warrior, he has a ship. If you replace one of the planks, is it still the same ship? If you replace half of it, still the same ship, and you replace all the parts. So I use a more modern example, and I use a car. Take a car. Suppose you replace all the tires. Is it literally the same car? Well, just chew on that. Let's take it a little further. Say you don't not only replace the tires, but now let's replace every single part of that car. Every part. Is it still the original? Same car. Again, before you answer that, take those replaced parts and let's reconstruct those and put those back together. Now you have two cars. Which one of those two is the original if either one is? Well, regardless of your answer, one thing is certain, they both can't simultaneously be the original if there is an original. And that, I would say, that's sufficient to demonstrate, because purely physical objects do not maintain their identity throughout change and part replacement. So purely physical objects, aggregates, don't maintain identity through change. Substances, I would argue, do. So here's a question. Am I a substance, an immaterial soul? And I haven't even defined soul. The soul would be an immaterial substance that contains consciousness and animates the body. You could even say animates and gives rise to or form to the body. So the soul is an immaterial substance that contains consciousness, animates, and gives rise to the body. Now, I am either an immaterial substance or an aggregate. So here's a question based on what I just explained. The syllogism would be, I am either a soul or an aggregate. Premise 2 would be, well, aggregates do not maintain identity through change. Premise 3, I do maintain identity through change. Therefore, I'm not a purely physical object, an aggregate. Therefore, I am a soul. Now, do we maintain identity through change? That's a question. Am I the same person from one moment to the next? Before I answer that, the moment you replace, I would argue, the moment you replace any part of your body, you are a different person. I mean, even if you scratch your arm, you're losing skin cells. But to to make it a little bit easier to kind of wrap your mind around, it said that virtually every 7 to 10 years, you virtually replace almost every cell in your body. So let's say 10 years ago, I murdered somebody and I hid the body. 10 years later, the police are knocking at my door and saying, you know, Eric, we finally have the evidence to convict you. We know that you're the murderer. And I say, officer, are you kidding me? That was some other guy 10 years ago. It wasn't me. Go find him. But good luck. He doesn't exist anymore. Sorry. You know, and I close the door. No, of course not. They're going to laugh at me and arrest me. Why? Because we know, I think we intuitively, we know that we remain the same person throughout change and part replacement. But if I remain the same person from one moment to the next, then you cannot be a purely physical object. You must be something transcending the physical, namely a soul. So, what is personhood? So, in other words, me being a person must be grounded in something. What is it grounded in? Well, if it's grounded in the body, then I am literally not the same person from one moment to the next. Once I clip a toenail, I'm a different person, or whatever the case is. But if I do remain the same from one moment to the next, then I must be something that transcends the physical, that maintains the identity to change, namely the soul. And so to reject that would be, you'd have to say that you're not the same person from one moment to the next. Again, and I'm not a shameless plug here, but on the review I did recently on my last video, when we talked about this, the atheist I was talking to, I asked him, are you the same person from one moment to the next? He said, no. Well, he tried to dodge the question at first, and I just kept pressing him. He said, okay, no. I said, so then how many people have I been talking to in the past hour and a half? And he looked like he got upset. He's like, no, that's irrelevant. I said, no, I mean, how many? And then he just keeps rambling. I said, no, I just want to know how many. He's like, oh, that's irrelevant. Doesn't matter. I said, well, I'm just curious now. How many times have I been talking to? Because that's what you would have to believe. Now, I don't know why he got upset. If you truly believe that, bite the bullet.
Yeah, be consistent.
Yeah, exactly. And as I said in that video, you either accept the conclusions of your position or you change your position. It's that simple. I mean, it's not my problem. That's how reality works. Okay. The other argument, indivisibility of personhood. Being a person, the question, okay, first we have to understand the notion of degreed and non-degreed properties. Again, I talk about this in the last video. So a degreed property, some properties can exist in various percentages or degrees that can be divided. These would be degreed properties. So for example, the property of being loud or hard. Loudness can go up or down. It can fluctuate in percentages. Hardness can be Hardness can be softer or harder because it's a property that can fluctuate and exist. A table, being a purely physical object, can be cut in half, and it would make sense to say you now have half of a table. Okay. Now, contrast that with non-degreed properties. The number 2 and the number 6 both possess a property of being even, but non-degreed properties are all or nothing kind of things. It either is or it isn't. There's no in between. So the number 2 and the number 6 are both even, but it would make no sense to say that the number 6 is more even than the number 2, because being even is a non-degreed property. It either is or isn't. There's no gradient there. So that being said, a simple question: is being a person a degreed or non-degreed property? Is personhood degreed or non-degreed? Well, before we answer, let's look at the implications. First of all, if personhood is grounded in the physical body, which my debate opponent said, yes, being a person is grounded in the body, then you would have to gauge being a person on the physical body and even on the amount of mass and matter that you have. But if that's the case, I asked him to see if he was consistent. I said, okay, if that's the case, if you chop off my arms and legs, am I half of a person? He said, no. I said, good, I agree. Because, you can have half a table, but that's because tables are aggregates and purely physical. But chopping off my arms and legs doesn't make me half a person. And then and she said, no. I said, oh, well, then I guess it seems that being a person is not degreed. Said, no, but if you cut your brain, you can't lose personhood. I said, okay, so now you're switching to the brain. Okay, you're just pushing back the goalposts, but let's look at that. Dandy Walker syndrome is a real thing to where sometimes people are born with only as little as 10% of a brain. It's like just basically a big cavity. Sometimes there's only 20% of brain. It varies. Are they 10% people or 15% people? Well, no, they're full-blown persons, who may have diminished or loss of functioning. But that would also go to show that if I'm still 100% a person with less functioning, then it follows that my personhood is neither grounded in the physical, nor can it be grounded in my functioning. I'm still a person. So I would argue that personhood is a non-degree property. The last one would be, well, men are typically larger than women, but am I more of a person than my wife? No, of course not. In fact, that's how a lot of the eugenics movement started. Well, these are the colored people or people that look like this are less of a person than we are. They're less evolved.
Yeah.
So we're justified in doing X, Y, Z to them. Well, time out. If personhood is not degreed, then it doesn't matter the size, the shape, the color, because we're all, and if being a person carries value, then it would also entail that if personhood can fluctuate, then so can your value. Now, that is heavily relevant to the abortion debate, because if a fertilized egg, which I think is just a name used to try to avoid, it's a person. If an embryo is a person, then it doesn't matter how big or small that person is. I'm not trying to be condescending here, but someone who's, is a dwarf or a midget is still 100% of a person, even though they're not as has as much mass and matter as I do. So I asked the question, in other words, does having more mass and matter mean that you matter more? No, of course not. Why? Well, that can only be possible if personhood is not agreed. But the fact that being a person is not a degree of property can only be possible if and only if your property of being a person is grounded in something that transcends the physical, namely the soul. So if everybody is a person, regardless of their physical mass, matter, or function, then it follows that person is not a degree property. But if person is not a degree property, then we have to be more than a brain and body. Therefore, we must be a soul. So the syllogism would be, again, I'm either a purely physical object or a soul. If I am a purely physical object or an aggregate, then I am a degree property. I'm not a degree property. Therefore, or I'm not divisible. Or gosh, you get where I'm going with it. Sorry, it's getting. I'll have to look up exactly how I wrote it verbatim, because there's a number of ways to write them up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say you could send them to me, and for those of you thinkers that are interested, we'll share them. So believe me, I get it, brother. Yeah, it gets late. There's times I can't recite the Kalam. I'm like, this should be easier than this.
So it'd be basically then person would be a degree property. I am not a degree property. I'm an all or nothing kind of thing. Therefore, I'm not a purely physical object. I am a soul.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Way better than any of us could do, brother.
Last one would be free will. And I kind of briefly touched on this earlier. So if all you are is a brain and body, then, and especially if atheism is true, we would have to assume that the law of causal closure is true, which is the view that the universe is a closed system and every physical event must necessarily be caused by a prior physical event. Okay. So I'll ask an atheist this question, or a physicalist this question. Okay, if you're purely physical, if when I raise my arm, what caused that? Now, by free will, I mean libertarian free will. In a nutshell, I would define free will as being the first mover of your will or actions. If there's any questions on that, I don't mind going into that. I reject the principle of dualability, or PAP, I reject that as a necessary condition. I do think we have dualability, but I don't think it's necessary for libertarian freedom. I think it's sufficient to identify libertarian freedom, but not necessary. So if you have it, if you have dualability, the ability to do otherwise, then I would say you have libertarian freedom. If you don't have the ability to do otherwise, it doesn't get you to no libertarian freedom. You have to ask the other question, well, am I the first mover of my will or actions? Again, I can explain more if I have to, but I'm the first mover. So if I'm the first mover of my will, then I have free will, genuine libertarian free will. If something else causes me, then I wasn't free. If I raise my hand and I was the source of that movement, I was free to do it. If I'm tased and it makes me raise my hand, I was not free. Okay, so the question is, am I the first mover? Well, if I am simply a purely physical object, then my brain and body are going to be confined and caused by the laws of chemistry and physics and caused by other physical chemical reactions. In other words, matter does not have the power to act on its own matter cannot act unless it is acted on by something external and prior to itself. A domino does not fall over by itself. It must be pushed, pulled, when, whatever the case is. So let's simple thought experiment. When I push over a domino, why did the 100th domino fall? Well, we can explain the 100th domino falling because the 99th. Why did that one fall? Eventually, you get to the first domino. Why did the first domino fall? Because I pushed it. And you think, okay, great, we've solved the problem. Well, time out. Just like the 100th domino needed an explanation for its falling, now I need an explanation for your finger. Here's where the rubber meets the road. Aristotle put it this way: if I move a rock with my staff, my hand moved the rock was moved by the staff was moved by my hand, but what moved me? Because, again, if I'm simply a link in a causal chain of events, I had no free will. If I was the source, I have free will. Okay, so I'll ask an atheist. Okay, so let's say you push that first domino. What caused your finger to push the domino? You might say, that's easy. Neurons fired in my brain. Problem solved. And since the neurons were in my brain, that means it started with me. Therefore, I'm the source and origin and source of my actions. I go, wait, time out. According to the law of causal closure, every physical event needs a physical explanation and cause. Neurons firing in your brain are still physical events. So what was the cause of that? At this point, I say they have two options and two options only. Both don't get you to free will. The first option is you can say, well, those were caused by a prior set of neurons firing. Okay. Same question. You've just pushed back the goalposts. What caused those neurons firing? Oh, well, there was a different set of neurons firing that caused the other set of neurons firing to cause that last set of neurons firing. Okay, cool. And what caused that? You can do that till the cows come home, but the problem is you lead into an infinite regress, and we know that infinite regresses are logically impossible. Given the fact that the first domino actually was pushed, then there had to be a starting point of those neurons firing caused by something else. In other words, it couldn't keep going. You can't just keep positing neurons firing in your brain. You have to get the ball rolling, which means your second option, I'd say, so that first option is not even an option, not even a viable option anymore. You have to go with your second option, which is to eventually at some point, however many neurons you want to posit, you're eventually going to have to go beyond your body and point to something external and prior to yourself that was a physical event that caused your neurons to fire. But the moment you point to something beyond and external to yourself, you now become a secondary mover, not a primary mover, and you are now merely another domino in the link of dominoes caused by something prior to yourself. And if that's the case, which it has to be on physicalism, then you cannot have libertarian free will. If you don't have libertarian free will, you can't have moral responsibility, and you can't have intellectual integrity, what I like to call it. For example, atheists usually like to tell me that, they're the most ironic thing I've heard atheists say is call themselves free thinkers. In my debate with Dillahunty, I pointed this out. I said, look, if there's no soul, then all your thoughts are literally caused by physical events prior to and beyond your control, which means you cannot have free will, including every thought that you ever had. So if physicalism is true, then every thought you had was caused by something physical prior to yourself, which means literally the last thing you can call yourself is a free thinker. So if you're not going to believe in the soul and you're going to be an atheist, you can't be a free thinker by default. So the irony is the last thing you can do is call yourself a free thinker if there's no soul. I think one person laughed in the audience. I guess tough crowd. And there's a lot of other stuff too. And I meet a lot of atheists who are proud to call themselves atheists. They wear it like a badge of honor. I'm an atheist, which means I'm not brainwashed. I am free to think for myself. I proudly came to this conclusion. Okay, did you do so freely? Because if you're telling me that based on your intellectual integrity to examine the evidence for yourself, you did this and became an atheist, then congratulations, you have free will. But if you have free will, you must have a soul, because anything physical cannot act on its own. And if you have free will, then I can point you, we'll just take a few more steps to point you to the fact that God has to exist in order for things like that, immaterial souls, to exist. So you either have free will and be a proud atheist, which would ironically point to the fact that God must exist, or you say there is no God and you cannot take any pride in being an atheist any more than you can take pride in the fact that it rained today and not yesterday. You had no control over either of it. And I like to say this, which means your reasons for being an atheist are just as rational as the reasons for which the religious nut on the street corner is yelling at people, saying provocative things, you'll have the same level of rationale, namely none, because you're both caused by physical events prior to yourself. So pick one. You either have free will and God exists, or you have no free will and being an atheist is no more rational than being, a Scientologist.
Right.
Pick
That's awesome.
So the syllogism would be, again, it's same formula, something like either purely physical object or a soul. Purely physical objects do not have free will. I do have free will, therefore I'm not a purely physical object, therefore I am a soul.
And just for the, if I understand this correct, just for the Calvinists watching, this wouldn't necessarily, I don't think, interfere with it, unless perhaps you'd have to be a really strict determinist. I don't think they exist, because most Calvinists would say, when they mean determined in that sense, they're talking about your salvation determined to believe. I don't know a whole lot that say every physical movement you have is determined. Now, I could be wrong. I mean, I'm sure they exist, so I should be careful there, but I don't think it's necessary. Am I correct on that?
Well, so here's the thing is, as much as I love my Calvinist brothers and sisters, any form, so compatibilism is still a form of determinism. And on compatibilism, you're not a first mover.
Right.
So whether you, and I have had, told Calvinists about this argument, and they're like, well, I like that argument, but I don't think it proves libertarian free will. And I'm thinking, well, the reason the argument works is because you're the first mover. And if you're a first mover, then you have libertarian free will. So you can't get around it. Now what I do, I try to be charitable and say, well, you can still use this argument and still claim that it doesn't prove libertarian free will, and then you can just focus on the fact that you have a soul. But I think there's inconsistency there. Yeah. Nevertheless, whether you're pointing to neurons firing in your brain or God causing you to do something, the fact is the reason for which you act is still caused by something external and prior to yourself. And if you have that, you don't have libertarian free will, which I don't mind. But then you get into the problems we talked about earlier.
Right, but you would have. I don't know why I even thought of that. The Calvinists could just say, well, then, yeah, the God, even though I don't have free will, there's still a God because He's doing it. So they could point to that. So I forgot that. I was just thinking for them, hey, could they still use it in a way? And yeah, the answer is they just would point to God. So that makes sense.
They can use it, and they can even, at least, because even people say, well, how do you know you have free will? It's an entirely different discussion. I think it's fairly intuitive that we do, but to put it more for some people, for easier to put a swallow, I basically say, well, if there is no soul, then in principle there is not even a possibility of free will. So the soul at least makes free will possible, because sure, I'll grant, I don't believe it, but sure, it could be the case that I have a soul, and Calvinism is true. So having a soul does not entail necessarily that free will exists, but if free will exists, then necessarily it must entail that I have a soul, because a soul is the necessary condition, ontologically speaking, for, in principle, the possibility of libertarian free will.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you for the distinction there. Brother, this has been awesome so far. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Couple things before we get to the questions, because some of you guys will start, I'm sure they'll start dropping off, although I don't know why they would, because this has been, I'm not kidding. I'm seeing comments from Erica saying as much. She had a question. I don't know if this is her or somebody else. Either way, it's a good question, which is, I'll read it to you directly, brother. Eric has so much great things to share. If he is up for it, let's have him on our channel again. Can he come back for more? And of course, my response was, yeah, but of course, that's up to you. Doesn't need to be tomorrow. It can be, 6 months from now, whenever, but anytime you want to come back, brother. I just want to let you know that now. We would love to have you back.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I'm not getting rid of you. I just wanted to mention that.
And this is good. So I really appreciate this, because so that when we talked, I don't know how many months ago you said we talked, and we even spent a few hours talking about this stuff, and I was drawing it out for you. And I remember thinking I should have recorded that, because since then I've maybe done that with one or two other people, maybe two people, and I'm thinking, man, if I just had a video, I could send them. So now I can just send them this video, and they can that'll save you some time if I need it. But no, I appreciate that. I like the fact that now we can have something to point to, and it'll give people a good idea of, kind of coming from.
Yeah, this is valuable. And I was thinking the same thing. You said, you could have recorded it on the Google Hangouts. I was like, what? Afterwards, because of course, that was the first time I think I had used Google Hangouts, so I wasn't aware of that. So Corinth asked, and he is, like I said, a great guy. He's got a lot of good questions. He has two questions. If there are any other questions anyone wants to ask, feel free to send them in. The distinction between the soul and the spirit, is that merely just a linguistic distinction?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I always get this question when I talk about the soul. Sorry, I have a cough drop in my mouth.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's just I can feel my throat getting dry, but it's just,
Mhm.
and not drinking enough water. So within the soul, again, your soul is like a list of your ultimate capacities. I say ultimate capacities because again, there are first order and second order capacities. I have the first order capacity to speak English, and I have the ultimate second order capacity to speak French. Now, I can't speak French, but I can utilize the capacities I have now to get to the point to where I can develop that second order capacity into a first order capacity to actually speak French. So I have the ability, but it's not actualized. Now that's important. Again, side note, bonus, fun fact. That's spiritual formation right there.
Mm.
I can't stop sinning. Let's say whatever a person's biggest struggle is this. They can't just cold turkey stop. They can will to, and I'm even opening a can of worms there because there's a difference between a will and an action. I was talking to a Calvinist once, and he said, "Can you fly like a bird? You don't have free will. You can't fly like a bird." I said, "Well, what does that have to do with whether or not I have free will?" He said, "Well, because if you had free will, you could fly like a bird." I said, "No, having free will doesn't entail I could fly like a bird. It just entails that I have the ability to will to fly like a bird, but I just can't fly like a bird." He's like, "Well, no, you can't fly like a bird." I said, "Right." He's like, "So you don't have free will?" I said, "No, I have the will to do it. I just can't do it." "Well, do you have a bird nature?" I said, "Look, if you're asking if I'm a bird, no, I'm not a bird. That doesn't mean I can't will to try and fly like a bird. I can will something without having the ability to bring about my will, which turns into an action, but my will comes before my action." Okay, that aside, because I'm getting off my train of thought here. So the capacities. That's right, spiritual formation. So one quick tip: how do I get to the point to where I can cease or lessen the degree to which I sin and with this struggle I have? Well, work on the capacities and wills that you have that you can control to eventually get to the point to where you can help and control further the things that you can't currently control. That's why Romans 7, I think Paul says, the things I want to do, I don't do. The things I don't do, I end up doing. I don't understand this, but I know there's nothing good within me. He says that is my flesh. And but the spirit man, is warning against the flesh. I wrote an article about that on the website. I think it's like Romans 7, free will and mental disorders. And I talk about the relationship between the soul and brain there, which reminded me, and I'm gonna write this down about free will. I forgot to mention it, but so anyway, so quick tip, and then I'll get to answering the question. Sorry.
No problem.
Whenever I teach on spiritual formation or even the soul, I tell people, look, you want to get better, be a better disciple, get better at your character, at your integrity, at your ability to will against sin. Next time you go to Walmart or whatever grocery store you choose, when you get to the checkout line, let's suppose you say, you know what, I'm not going to get this bag of chips after all. 99% of people grab that bag of chips, look to the left and right, and kind of put it in the candy shelves right next to them, right? Same thing. When you go to your car and you load all your groceries in, 99% of the people look to the left and right, and they put their cart right behind my car so I can hit it when I back out. Right. So what am I saying here? We can control these things. It just takes the will to do it. So next time you're at the grocery line and you don't want to buy something, I challenge you, get out of line and go and put it back from where you got it from and get back in line. That takes a lot of effort. Sure it does. But guess what? You teach yourself that your body's not in control. You are. Next time you unload your groceries, put the grocery cart into the into the cart area. Why? This is why fasting is important. When you fast, you teach your body you're not in control. You don't tell me what to do. I tell you what to do. Your body may say, I am starving. I need food. You say, that's fine. You're not in control, big guy. I am. Hence,
Right.
you beat your flesh into submission. The more you fast, the more self-control you tend to have because anger usually arises from belly feelings. So the more you can control that feeling of hunger and have authority over that and not allow your feelings to control your behavior, the more exercise and stronger will you have and become. Hence, spiritual formation and discipleship. So that was just a long-winded free fact there. Okay, so the soul is a list of capacities and things, faculties, a group of similar capacities. We call them faculties. Merlin says, think of like a chest of drawers, or like a drawer. You have a sock drawer, underwear drawer, t-shirt drawer, pant drawer. Each drawer has a different set of things. My soul has a capacity for consciousness, has a capacity for communication with God, has a capacity for these other certain things. Excuse me. The spirit is a capacity of the soul. I am a substance dualist. I used to be what's called a trichotomist, where I used to think there's 3 substances, body, soul, and spirit. Now I say there's only 2 substances, but the spirit is part of the soul. This is important to understand because people say, well, wait a minute, the Bible talks about a body, soul, and spirit. Absolutely it does. It also talks about the heart and the mind and the feet and the hands and the tongue and the eyes. How many hands do you have? 2. Oh, so you have 2 bodies. No, I have 1 body. But wait a minute, you have 2 hands. Oh, yeah, but the hands are part of my 1 body. Ah, okay, cool. So I have 1 substance, it's a material, it's a soul. I call that the captain of the ship, and the ship is all the other parts. My spirit is a faculty of my soul, but it's not a separate entity or substance from my soul. The captain of the ship may have different cells, but he is a captain that governs all of them. Again, I have 2 hands, 1 body, 10 fingers, 1 body, 2 legs, 1 body. They are part of my 1 body. The spirit is a part of my soul. Why am I not a trichotomist? I used to be. Well, because you have 3 things. Body, according to the trichotomist, there's 3 things, even though the Bible talks about more than 3. So I don't know why there's body, soul, spirit. Well, you also got mind. Well, mind's part of the soul. Well, why can't the spirit be part of the soul? Anyways, so according to the trichotomist, there's 3 substances. Now, you have to be one of these substances. I think Scripture teaches that it is in virtue of your spirit that you have relation with God. Okay, I asked someone one time, when I pray, if there's 3 things here, when I pray, is it my soul praying or my spirit? They said, my spirit's praying. I said, okay, so which one are you? Are you the soul or the spirit? Oh, I'm the soul. Okay, well, then who's that guy praying over there? That's me. Okay, so you're the spirit. Okay, yeah, I'm the spirit. Okay. When you have thoughts of, inappropriate thoughts, is that the soul or the spirit? That's the soul. Okay, so then you're not sinning, it's your soul sinning. No, I am sinning. Okay, so which, you know what I'm saying? So who's controlling the ship here? Because there can only be one, and whoever that is, then the other 2 are simply parts of, or something else. If my spirit prays, but I'm not my spirit, then that's not me praying. That's something else. So yeah, so I hold to a what's called substance dualism. 2 substances, because technically the body is not a substance; it's an aggregate. But there's physical matter, but I am an immaterial soul. The best way to put it is, I am a soul with a body. I don't quote have a soul. I am a soul. I have a body, and without my soul, my body's just a corpse. So I don't quote have a soul. I am a soul. I have a body. Now, the punchline I use in my presentations is, well, actually, I do have a soul. It's outside and it's orange, and I just got it a few months ago. But so I do have 2 souls, my me as a soul and my Kia soul. But yeah, so I am a soul. I don't have a soul. I am a soul. I have a body.
Nice. That's awesome, brother. Thank you for that. The Corinth had another one, and the reason I pushed some of Corinth's back, so if you're wondering, like, wow, he's got all these, it's because I could tell based on what you were going to be talking about, sort of tried to organize some of these. So the question was, the concept of the soul as set forth by reincarnationists, such as Hindus and Buddhists, how best to rebut that? So I'm not sure if that's something you've come across or not, but
so whenever people may have beliefs, just a tip here, because I mean, there's more than one ways it's going to count, if you will. My initial knee-jerk reaction would be to say, well, rebut what? I can respond to an argument, but I can't respond to an assertion or belief. Someone says, well, I believe in reincarnation. I say, cool, why?
Right, you need the argument.
But yeah, what was the evidence for? And a side note, this is something I think a lot of apologists need to understand, is that when atheists, skeptics, or people who disagree with you, it doesn't have to just be about philosophy and apologetics. With anything, you don't have an obligation to respond to assertions. You can only respond to arguments. So like in my discussion with Tom Jump again, it's just the most recent one I had, so I keep referring to it, and I have 2 funny videos on that. He basically said something like, because he said, well, we don't know what consciousness is. I said, well, I do. He says, no, you don't. Have you done this and this and that? And he goes, no. He goes, well, you can assert that you do. He goes, but you don't know. I said, right. And you can assert I don't. He goes, yeah, I can. I said, right. So what? He said, she said, I know you're. What am I? What? So what's the point of making assertions? Let's get back to the argument. Let's get to talk. Right. So if someone makes an assertion, there's nothing to respond to. If someone, if people say, well, there's no soul. Why? Well, because damage to the brain causes memory loss. Go on. Continue, please. Well, that's it. Well, so because if you hit my head really hard, there's no soul. What am I missing here? And I think that's really important to when people do those kind of things, you don't let them get away with it. Press them to give you an explanation, to unpack them. I mean, people can't just make statements and assume their position is true. They'd have to demonstrate it. Now, that being said, again, it would have to. So technically, the existence of the soul does not disprove reincarnation. Disproving reincarnation would take something further than simply the fact that I am not my body. Now, if anything, you could say it could show that in principle there could be reincarnation. And then I would have to say, and I'm just thinking off the cuff, and then I have to say, well, define reincarnation, because if reincarnation means you come back into another body, well, then I wouldn't call the resurrection another body, but it certainly isn't going to be this body that I have in the resurrection, but I wouldn't call that reincarnation. So how do you define reincarnation?
Right.
If anything, in reincarnation, I'm not changing. My shell, my guitar changes, but I don't change. So I would ask how you define reincarnation, how you even would measure that in the first place. That's where I would start, is by kind of getting clarity on what they mean by that.
Okay, yeah, that makes perfect sense. It's funny because what you were just talking about in regards to rebutting, we get this, and I'm certain you have, and probably all our viewers, if they've done apologetics for more than a week, have come across this. They say, well, I'm an atheist because science, logic, and you go, I want the cricket sound effect right after that.
Right.
That's not an argument. It's a statement. I don't even know what that means. You might as well say because bananas and apples.
Right.
I need an argument. What logical argument are you thinking of? What scientific data are you thinking of that you're going to need to put into a logical argument for me to understand? So I get that. I know a lot of folks have been asking for more resources, if there are any, in terms of books. So I know we mentioned several of J.P. Moreland's. Anything else that you would want to recommend?
That would be my highest recommendation, would be The Body and Soul. Because as Swinburne has a book, I think it's called The Evolution of the Soul. I've read bits and pieces of it. Sorry. He has a really good thought experiment about the split brain, and it goes into if you get a person, cut them in half, and place each of those halves onto two other halves, which one will you be if either one? You can either be person number one or person number two. And he says, or could you be both? He says, one thing is clear is that you can't be both, because imagine they said, hey, we're going to do an operation on you. We're going to cut you in half, place you on two other halves of bodies. We're going to send one to Hawaii with $1 million. We're going to send the other one to a torture chamber for 100 years. What do? You take the gamble and say, yeah, sure, let's do it. Why not? Because one question would be, will you even survive? Because it could be the case that, let's say it's A and B. You could be person A, and person B is someone entirely different. You can be person B, and someone A is entirely different. Or you could cease to exist, and two entirely new people come to exist. You don't know. And I think it goes to show that that's because we're not the same thing as our bodies, and we're something beyond the physical. But we certainly couldn't be both, because that's not how we operate. That's not how we work. So anyways, you can even look on YouTube. There's a good thing on that. Swinburne, Evolution of the Soul. I heard he's coming out with something else on the soul. Jeffrey Schwartz, who's not necessarily a philosopher, he's a neuroscientist, used to be a Buddhist. Moreland debated him years ago, is now a believer. He's one of the world's leading neuroscientists. I think he's at UCLA. He has done, from what I understand, incredible work in the areas of cognitive behavioral therapy, dealing with patients with OCD and anxiety, stuff like that. That's what I was going to talk about earlier with neuroscience. Basically, what he does is he tells his patients, and his book is called You Are Not Your Brain. Again, this is a neuroscientist, because I hear people saying, well, if you just understood the neuroscience, you wouldn't believe in the soul. First, it's not a question of neuroscience, big guy. It's a philosophical question about metaphysics, not science. saying that, science doesn't prove the soul, or it would be like saying, like the one I hear all the time is, my metal detector, there's no plastic on the beach because my metal detector didn't pick anything up. Well, sure, metal detectors are great for detecting metal, but not plastic. Science is great for detecting the physical, but if my soul is not physical, why would you use science to try and detect something non-physical? You're using a metal detector to detect plastic. Anyways, his book is You're Not Your Brain. He basically shows that if you can think different, not too much time to go in depth into it, but anxiety and depression are chemical imbalances in the brain that are imposed on you that make you feel a certain way. If you wake up from a nightmare, you look around and you're like, oh, I'm safe, I'm fine, it was just a dream. But you're still going to be really, really scared for about another minute or few minutes because those chemicals have not drained out your body yet. That's how it is with someone who suffers from anxiety and depression. These are chemicals in the brain that impose a feeling on that person. And because of that, they're experiencing certain thoughts and emotions. What Jeffrey Schwartz does is there's like a 4-step method that basically, in a nutshell, he teaches a person how to challenge those thoughts and feelings that are imposed on them by their chemical imbalance of the brain. And they did this experiment once where they took a picture of the brain and its chemical composition before, like when, and then he gave this person the prescription, if you will, to do this for the next few months. A few months later, they take a picture of the brain, and the brain has rewired itself chemically. The neurons are firing differently.
Wow.
What does that show? One, if consciousness is not physical, then changing the way you think can affect and change the physical. Neurons, it's called neuroplasticity. They can stretch, expand, and reconnect. Now, if that's the case, then not only can affecting my brain affect my soul, but my soul acting differently can affect my brain. So it's actually a two-way causal street. But if I can affect the chemistry of my brain by thinking differently, then I must transcend the physical components of my brain and body, which means I must have free will and must have a soul, because I can act other and contrary to the chemical dispositions that are given to me by my body. I can reject, refrain, and act against them.
Nice.
So I think neuroplasticity would be very strong evidence in favor of libertarian free will and the soul.
That is awesome, brother.
So yeah, but there was the books. That one, sorry.
No,
There's these next two are going to be pretty heavy. So if you're not familiar with I mean, you could go for it because I did. The first one is I think it's the argument for God from consciousness or something like that. It's a blue book, and they're in my office. A blue book by Moreland, something like Arguments for God, or in fact, again, plugging in that video. In the first video I did of my review, I show a picture of those two books, the Body and Soul and the blue book Arguments for God by J.P. Moreland. He basically gives his argument and goes through like 5 or 6 popular atheists who specialize in the philosophy of mind, and kind of responds to their position. In the debate I did with Dillahunty, a lot of the arguments and illustrations I use came from atheist philosophers. This is not just a quote Christian thing. Some atheists believe in some type of a soul, and believe that. And Thomas Nagel, that's again kind of worms here, but Thomas Nagel, he wrote a book called Mind and Cosmos: Why the Materialistic Neo-Darwinian Evolutionary Picture is Probably Almost Certainly False.
We have that one. Yeah.
So basically, he's arguing that, look, evolution can't explain where our minds come from, because we know that you can't just get matter, rearrange it, and get more matter. We have to be able to explain consciousness, and we can't use evolution. Now, his position is he thinks everything has the potential to be conscious. It's called panpsychism. So if you just arrange matter a certain way, it'll be conscious. Google panpsychism and look at the images. There's a lot of funny stuff, like toasters with eyeballs and stuff like that. A lot of funny stuff. Anyways, philosopher jokes.
Yeah.
I can go on with that, but okay. So that even Nagel's book would be good to read. And the last one would be one I got recently, and I've only read some of it: Blackwell's Companion to Substance Dualism.
I saw that, but wasn't sure. So thank you for the recommendation. And if Eric is still watching, no, I'm not going to buy that today. Just not going on my list. I bought like 20 books the other day, so I got to slow down.
No, I know what you mean. Gosh, I wish I liked reading in the first. I honestly don't like reading, and on top of that, I'd prefer audio books, and there's not very many scholarly audio books on that kind of stuff.
Yeah, Moreland's books and Scientism and science or whatever that is. That's on audio, but yeah, I know what you mean. That's the same problem for me.
Yeah.
I have ADD, and so it's hard for me to.
Exactly. But
I'm
yeah,
kind
there's different views and positions on the soul, and that substance dualism book goes into almost every position on the soul, because there's different views on soul and like even the origin of the soul and stuff like that. I mean, it is such a great, wide, interesting, deep topic that I mean, you could study it. I haven't even studied it that long, but even in the few years that I've studied it, there's still a lot more questions I have and stuff I want to look into. And there's always I always like to go back and brush up on stuff. But it's incredibly fascinating because again, the implications are basically endless. And again, I don't want to open a can of worms, but anything from how the soul comes from to Molinism, there's a connection there. I'd say between like people's lineage, and I couldn't exist if it weren't for my parents. My parents couldn't exist if it weren't for their parents, which means if God wanted me to exist and elected me, and let's say he elected me prior to the foundations of the world, then he would have had to know the future and have ordained my parents to exist, which would be a Molinistic position in that God knew the different possibilities of what could happen. And on that knowledge, made a decision to create a world in which I existed, which would be a Molinist perspective. So if the Traducian view of the soul is true, that I in part exist because of my parents and their soul, then I would say Molinism has to be true if the Traducian view of the soul is true. I mean, there's just a lot of connections to all this kind of stuff. And
That's awesome. Yeah, for me, I use God and time to relate a lot of things, but I like this because this is sort of that's only dealing with God. So here, this is dealing with us. So I like that because it helps me to compartmentalize things to understand them better. Like mile high view, if that makes sense.
yeah, absolutely.
Man, that is awesome. Brother Corinth said, I don't know if he had to go or if he just wanted to let you know this. He said, tell Brother Eric he's doing an excellent job, by the way. And I'm going to rewatch this probably tomorrow. And yeah, I am too, Corinth. This is awesome, Eric.
I really appreciate that.
Let me say this too, because it's been on my mind for a while. And Eric is a very humble guy. He may say no, but I'm saying yes. Please, for those that are watching this tonight or tomorrow, whenever, do me a favor, just consider, even if you can't, maybe in the future, go into Eric's website and donating something on that donate thing, because this is an awesome thing that he's doing for everybody. You have no idea the level of knowledge. This is college level kind of course right now that he's giving you guys, giving all of us. So am I going to do the same thing? Yeah, I'll put my money where my mouth is. But just consider that, he does this because he loves it. And as a Christian, an apologist, he wants to do it. And there's tons of stuff we haven't even hit, and we won't get to it tonight, but there's stuff. He's got tips on apologetics, so I hope he will come back. That I was looking at these, I was like, yeah, these are good. And then I went back and reread them. I was like, oh, yeah, these are awesome. I didn't, and I'm sorry about that, Eric. I didn't read them. I know I apologized once already. I read one of them and misunderstood. I was like, oh, yeah, that's good. I wanted the soul stuff, but when I went back and reread it, I was like, oh, no, these are priorities because of it's methodology, guys. Anyone can have data, but when you have methodology, that's a whole nother world. That's what we all go to college for, is really should be methodology. Why? Because in today's society, all these books, you've got data, but methodology is key. So that's I don't know if you have anything else you want to say, brother, but I wanted to throw that in there.
I appreciate that very much, and yeah, I mean, you're right. Of course, I didn't ask you to do that. Didn't even expect you to do that. I appreciate that. I honestly, and that's another long story, just a testament of how I get into apologetics. And now what I do, I work now for Texas Baptist as a lead apologist. So my full-time job is to do apologetics. So technically, even right now, this is considered, I'm working, so to speak. But yeah, it's something I love, and just to encourage any of the listeners and even anyone listening after this has been recorded and it's been out there for a while, find what you're passionate about and what you feel called to do, and don't compromise on it. Don't let money be an issue. Now, of course, you have a wife and kids like I do. Of course, I never don't neglect your family either. I don't want to get into too much of a sob story, but basically, first week or so of marriage, my wife loses her job. So, we're staying with my parents. And, we think, oh, we can just save up. She loses her job. She finally gets a job. We get just enough to maybe apply for a house. And we're praying one time. I felt the Lord saying, hey, go ahead and go look for a house. First person we go to look into getting a house says, yeah, they approved you for very little. You're not going to find a house. Why don't you go ahead and just wait and save up money and come back later? And I'm thinking, well, God told me I could. So we went to someone else, and finally a bank did approve us. Yeah, I was getting frustrated to the point to where I was even getting frustrated with God. My wife was getting frustrated with God and getting frustrated with me. Um, and I mean, it was tough, and there was even times where I'm like, maybe I should just go work at a plant. Nothing wrong with working at a plant by all means. But I know that wasn't my calling. Yeah, I was called to ministry, but I also wasn't making the money I needed to. Uh, long story short, again, and I know I say that a lot, we found a house that was not only within our budget, but was under our budget that what we paid for, and was basically a brand new house, almost basically exactly what we asked for, 3-bedroom, 2-bath, that we got for under the budget we were approved for. A lot of people said, you're not going to find a house for that. God did it. I mean, I cried the first night we moved in. Fast forward about a year into that, because that was only like a couple years ago, maybe 3 years ago. Fast forward about a year into that, my wife gets pregnant. Praise God, but now she stops working. We were in a house, just got a house. Wife stops working. I pick up another job. At this point I'm working 3, sometimes 4 jobs. I don't even want to get into nothing illegal, of course, but I was busting my butt outside in the heat, cutting grass. It was tough, and it got to the point to where some days I was only sleeping 2 or 3 hours. Some days I was working 3 jobs, waking up at 5, sometimes 6, not getting home till about 2 or 3 in the morning. And it was getting to the point to say, look, Lord, as much as I feel called, I want to do ministry, I can't keep this up. I'm going to have to go work somewhere else that's going to pay me more, because the jobs I was at, they were flexible jobs. It gave me time to study and gave me the flexibility to travel if I needed to, but it wasn't paying much. Christians don't really care too much a lot of times about theology stuff. So, an atheist would get, lots of support and this and that. I'd get 3 likes on Facebook if I was lucky, right? And I even remember getting mad at God, being like, wow, thanks for giving me the one calling that not everybody even knows exists, apologetics. And then not very many churches want it, and not very many churches that want it could afford it. And, I'm just like, wow, thanks a lot, God. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Again, end of the day, though, I just remember, telling my wife, just pray, see what God wants us to do. Long story short, I get a text from Leighton saying, hey, there's a job opening going to be at Texas Baptist, yada, yada, yada. I said, look, I know my wife's not going to want to move, so if I have to move, don't even think about it, because I know my wife's not going to want to. He's like, you wouldn't consider moving. I'm like, well, tell me what's it like, what's it pay, what are the requirements, blah, blah, blah. She tells me. So like, I still got to talk to my wife. When I get home and tell my wife, her answer is, so where do you think we'd live in Dallas? And I said, are you seriously? Are you kidding? Like, I said, Lord? I said, that threw me off. Again, just try to keep it as brief as possible. Here we are today. I got hired in July. We moved in September. Not a day goes by that I don't wake up extremely grateful. The position was basically created for me after I got hired. They kind of reassessed the position and created this position. Did not exist before me getting here. Craig Hazen, the director of apologetics for Biola University, probably the world's greatest place for apologetics. We met with him, and I'm not name dropping. We met with him about a month or 2 ago about partnering to do some stuff with Biola. And he looked at me in the middle of me talking. He goes, you know how many people I know would kill for your job? I said, absolutely. I said, absolutely. And I don't take it for granted. I say all that to say, I've never done this for the money, but of course we need money to survive. I mean, let's just be honest. And I've already did it because I had the calling for it. I cared about people. You had reached out to me on Facebook, 5 or 6 months ago. We didn't know each other. And you were asking about something, and I think you're a great, humble guy too. You even said, hey, can we talk about, or can you teach me some of this? I'll pay you. I said, don't worry. I said, don't worry about paying me, man. I'd love to spend the time with you. And I say that just to, I didn't ask you to donation thing. People are welcome to, they don't have to, but at the end of the day, it really is about the kingdom, about souls, about, not this life, but the next. And that I genuinely have a heart for people, have a heart for the lost. Every time I do debates, I try to spend as much, if not more, time praying for my opponent than I do preparing for, to debate him. So, yeah, it's something I take very seriously.
Amen, brother. Yeah, and yeah, just so everyone knows, Eric's right. He didn't say anything to me about that. I didn't tell him, because he is a humble guy, and I knew, he might say, no, don't do that, and I didn't want that. I wanted to be able to ask forgiveness later for doing it than permission. It's easier, right? So, and it's the pastor in me. Got to have that love offering. So, just, if, like I said, if it pressed upon your heart, the reason I'm stressing that too, though, is as a compliment to Eric, in that this really is great material. And I hope it's been a blessing to you guys as well, because man, I mean, seriously, he just condensed most of those resources he gave you into bite-sized nuggets. So now when you go back and watch this video, ladies and gentlemen, and then later on you read those books, they're going to make sense, because you're going to have a reference for a lot of that. You know, oh, this is what Eric was talking about. This is what, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. I know where these categories are. Categories are a huge thing in terms of philosophy. And then the categories Eric's giving us have to do with metaphysics, as he's mentioned. So this is brilliant, because I'm telling you, I've got a book right here in front of me. I was reading today on metaphysics. I've recommended this from the library to you guys. And why? Because as Christians, this stuff is fundamentally critical when we're debating this stuff or just talking to people about it, and they're saying there's no such physical thing, there's no soul, there's no this, there's no that. These are our weapons, partly. So yeah, anyway, anything else, Brother Eric, you wanted to add?
No, I appreciate that. Appreciate the listeners, taking the time to you and tell your wife. So thank you, and the kids, for sharing the time with me as well. Yeah, anybody willing to stay on for almost 3 hours,
Yeah,
talk about philosophy, hey, hats off to you, because few and far between with us. But yeah, I appreciate it. Sorry if I was long-winded, but I'm really appreciative that we got to, this can now be up and out there, for people to anytime to come check out and go back and listen to.
yeah,
And you're right about, but I did this with a student that I actually used to coach back in when I lived in Houston, and she was doing a research paper for something, and she's starting to get into this kind of stuff. Long story short, the student was telling me that they've been watching videos of other people, even atheists and other people, talk about philosophy of mind and soul, and they were like, and I was able to follow what they're saying because all the terms they were using, I understood them because of our conversation and all that. So I was like, that's awesome. So yeah, absolutely. You'd be much better equipped to, next time you hear someone talk about these things, you at least have a notion of where they're coming from or what's going on.
Yeah, that's awesome. Hang tight for a second, brother. All right, hey, y'all, don't forget, we'll be having streams next week. We are going to have John from JMD Apologetics 101 on. I know he was on earlier. We've kept trying to have him on. Things have gone wrong technology wise. We are going to have him on. I don't know why the devil doesn't want him on. It's happening. All right, so that will happen. Also, please check out Eric's website. I know, like I said earlier, you can find him on Facebook and whatnot, and his links are down, at least the website, in the description box. And guys, take care. God bless. We love you, and we'll see you again very soon.